They said she was too plain, too sharp-tongued, too educated for any decent man to want. Evelyn Moore had accepted her fate as the last woman standing in Redwood Hollow's marriage market, a spinster at 26, pitied by the wives and dismissed by every bachelor in town. But on a freezing November morning, when Lucas Harrington, the wealthiest rancher in Montana Territory, walked into her father's general store and asked for her by name, everything she thought she knew about her worth shattered. What the town whispered behind closed doors was about to explode into the open, and Evelyn would have to choose: stay small and safe, or claim the life no one believed she deserved. Before we begin this journey through love, dignity, and defiance in the American frontier, I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this story. If Evelyn's courage moves you, please hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now, let's step into Redwood Hollow, Montana, in the winter of 1887, where one woman's story is about to change everything. The first snow of November fell on Redwood Hollow like a whispered judgment, soft and relentless, covering the town's rough timber buildings and muddy streets in a blanket of white that made everything look cleaner than it actually was. Evelyn Moore stood behind the counter of Moore's General Store, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she tallied the week's inventory in the leather-bound ledger her father had given her 3 years ago, when he'd finally admitted that her head for numbers was better than his had ever been. Outside, she could hear the muffled voices of Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Chen pausing near the storefront window, their conversation carrying through the thin glass with the clarity of women who'd long ago stopped caring who might overhear them. 26 years old and still unmarried, Mrs. Pemberton was saying, her tone dripping with the particular kind of pity that was really just cruelty wearing a respectable dress. Such a shame. Her mother must be beside herself. Well, what did they expect? Mrs. Chen replied, adjusting her shopping basket. The girl reads more than she smiles, and she's got opinions on everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. What man wants a wife who'll argue with him over breakfast? And that face, so severe. She could at least try to look pleasant. Plain as prairie grass, my herald says. No amount of ribbons will fix that. Evelyn's pen paused over the ledger for only a moment before she continued her calculations. She'd heard variations of this conversation hundreds of times over the past 5 years, ever since she'd turned 21, and the town had collectively decided that her unmarried status was both a personal failure and a topic of endless public interest. The words still stung. They always did. But she'd learned to let the pain wash through her quickly, like yanking out a splinter. Acknowledge it, then move on. The bell above the door chimed, and the two women bustled inside, their conversation cutting off with surgical precision as they caught sight of her. They smiled with practiced warmth, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "Good morning, Evelyn, dear," Mrs. Pemberton cooed, setting a short list on the counter. "Just a few items today. How is your dear mother feeling?" "She's well, thank you," Evelyn replied, her voice professionally neutral as she scanned the list. "I'll have these ready for you in just a moment." As she moved through the store gathering flour, sugar, and tinned peaches, she caught their exchanged glances in the reflection of the window glass, the slightly raised eyebrows, the tiny shake of Mrs. Chen's head. She was a curiosity to them, a cautionary tale they'd tell their daughters. This is what happens when you don't learn to be charming, when you value books over beauty, when you forget that a woman's primary purpose is to make herself pleasant enough for a man to choose. The truth was more complicated than they knew, but Evelyn had long ago stopped trying to explain herself to people who'd already decided who she was. She'd had suitors once, back when she was 19 and 20. Thomas Weatherby had courted her for 3 months before admitting, after she gently corrected his misunderstanding of basic geography, that he preferred a woman who made him feel intelligent. James Morrison had lasted 6 weeks before telling her father that while Evelyn was a fine enough girl, he needed someone softer, more biddable. And Daniel Cross had simply stopped calling after she'd beaten him at chess 3 times in a row. After Daniel, the invitations had stopped coming. The young men of Redwood Hollow had apparently compared notes and reached a consensus. Evelyn Moore was too much trouble for too little reward. Her mother had tried everything. She'd bought Evelyn new dresses in softer colors, had coached her on smiling more and speaking less, had practically begged her to just pretend to be a little less clever, dear, at least until after the wedding. But Evelyn couldn't do it. She'd tried, for her mother's sake, but the act of diminishing herself felt like slowly suffocating, and she'd rather be alone than spend her life pretending to be smaller than she was. So she'd poured herself into the store instead, transforming it from her father's barely profitable venture into a thriving business. She'd reorganized the inventory system, negotiated better prices with suppliers, and even started a small lending library in the corner, 3 shelves of books that she carefully curated and maintained, charging a penny a week for rentals. The store was now the most successful in town, and everyone knew it was because of her, even if they pretended otherwise. "Will there be anything else?" Evelyn asked as she wrapped the items and calculated the total. Mrs. Pemberton leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I heard that the Harrington Ranch is hiring again. Perhaps they need someone to help with their bookkeeping. I know how you love your numbers." It was meant kindly, Evelyn supposed, though the underlying message was clear. Since you'll never marry, you might as well find more work to fill your empty life. "I'll keep that in mind," Evelyn said, handing over the wrapped parcels. "That'll be $2.35. After the women left, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of stillness, her hands flat on the counter, her eyes closed. The store was quiet now, just the tick of the wall clock and the whisper of snow against the windows. In these moments, when she was alone, she sometimes let herself imagine a different life, one where her sharp mind was valued instead of tolerated, where her opinions were sought instead of silenced, where someone might look at her and see strength instead of severity. But those were dangerous thoughts, the kind that led to disappointment. Better to focus on what was real: the store, the books, the careful life she'd built from the scraps of acceptance she'd been given. The bell chimed again. Evelyn opened her eyes and looked up, expecting another customer with another list and another barely concealed opinion about her unmarried state. Instead, Lucas Harrington stood in her doorway. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. Everyone in Redwood Hollow knew Lucas Harrington, though few could claim to actually know him. He was the wealthiest man in 3 counties, owner of the sprawling Harrington Ranch that stretched across thousands of acres of Montana grassland. He was 34 years old, devastatingly handsome in a way that seemed almost carved from the mountains themselves. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the prairie. He was also famously reclusive. Since his wife's death 5 years ago, a tragedy everyone whispered about, but no one fully understood, Lucas had retreated into his ranch like a wounded animal into its den. He came to town perhaps once a month, always alone, always silent, except for the bare minimum of necessary conversation. He ignored the fluttering eyelashes of the town's unmarried women, the not-so-subtle invitations from ambitious mothers, the general assumption that a man of his wealth and position should remarry as soon as decently possible. And now he was standing in her store, snowflakes melting in his dark hair, looking directly at her with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Miss Moore," he said, his voice low and rough, like he didn't use it often enough to keep it smooth. "Mr. Harrington." She was proud that her voice came out steady. "How can I help you today?" He moved toward the counter, his boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Up close, she could see the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. This was not a man at peace with himself. "I understand you're well-read," he said without preamble, "that you maintain the lending library here." "Yes," Evelyn replied, surprised. "I do. Are you looking for something specific?" "I'm looking for someone," he corrected, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. "Someone who knows books, who can organize them, catalog them properly. I have a collection at the ranch. It's gotten out of hand." Evelyn blinked. This was not what she'd expected. "You want to hire someone to organize your library?" "Yes. I'm sure there are professional librarians in Billings who would—" "I'm asking you." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and clear as the cold outside. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it, too blunt, too direct. Her mother would have been horrified, but Lucas didn't seem offended. If anything, something that might have been the ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "Because I've been watching what you've done with the lending collection here, the way you've categorized them, the care you take. And because He paused, choosing his words carefully. Because I need someone who cares about the books themselves, not about getting close to me. The honesty of it struck her like a physical thing. He knew then. He knew about the women who threw themselves at him, who saw his wealth and his loneliness as an opportunity. I care about books, Evelyn said quietly, more than most people think I should. I know. Those two words carried weight, carried knowledge. Had he been watching her? The thought should have been unsettling, but instead it sent a strange warmth through her chest. Will you come look at the collection? Before you decide. I can send a carriage for you tomorrow afternoon. Evelyn's mind raced. This was work, honest work, exactly the kind of project that would engage every part of her mind that the store couldn't quite satisfy. But it was also dangerous. Not because of Lucas himself, she somehow knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that he would never harm her, but because of what the town would say. A young unmarried woman spending time alone with the territory's wealthiest bachelor? Even if it was purely professional, even if she was just organizing books, the gossip would be vicious. I would need to bring a chaperone, she heard herself say, for propriety. Of course, bring whoever you like. My housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, will be there as well. And this would be a paid position? Naturally, whatever rate you think is fair. Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the handsome face and the expensive coat to the man underneath. What she saw surprised her. There was loneliness there, yes, bone deep and aching. But there was also intelligence in those storm-gray eyes, and something else, something that looked almost like hope? All right, she said before she could talk herself out of it. I'll come look at your collection tomorrow. The smile that broke across his face was small but genuine, transforming him completely. For just a moment, he didn't look like the untouchable Lucas Harrington, wealthy rancher and tragic widower. He looked like a man who'd just been given something he desperately wanted. 2 o'clock? He asked. 2 o'clock, she confirmed. He nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door he paused and looked back at her. Thank you, Miss Moore. I think you'll be impressed by what I have to show you. Then he was gone, leaving only wet footprints and the faint scent of leather and pine and something else she couldn't quite name. Evelyn sank onto the stool behind the counter, her legs suddenly unsteady. What had she just agreed to? The news spread through Redwood Hollow faster than the influenza that had swept through the previous winter. By dinner time, Evelyn's mother had heard from 3 different sources that her daughter had been seen in intense private conversation with Lucas Harrington. By the time Evelyn closed the store and walked home through the snow-hushed streets, her mother was waiting with the kind of barely contained excitement that made Evelyn's stomach knot with anxiety. Is it true? Margaret Moore demanded the moment Evelyn stepped through the door of their modest house on Cedar Street. Did Lucas Harrington really come to the store specifically to see you? He came to hire me, Evelyn corrected, unwinding her scarf. He needs someone to organize his library. Her mother's face fell slightly. Oh, just work. Yes, Mother, just work. But still, hope crept back into Margaret's voice, the way it always did when any unmarried man showed any interest in Evelyn, no matter how platonic. He chose you. Out of all the women in town, he chose you. He chose someone who knows about books, Evelyn said firmly, moving past her mother toward the stairs. That's all. But later that night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the wind howl around the eaves, Evelyn couldn't help but replay the conversation in her mind. The way Lucas had looked at her, the way he'd said, I've been watching, the strange electric feeling that had passed between them when their eyes met. Just work, she told herself firmly. It's just a job. Don't be foolish enough to imagine anything else. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, her dreams were full of storm-gray eyes and rare, transformative smiles. The carriage arrived promptly at 2 o'clock the next afternoon, driven by a weathered cowhand who introduced himself simply as Pete and helped Evelyn and her friend Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who'd agreed to serve as chaperone, into the elegant vehicle. Sarah, who was everything Evelyn was not, petite, pretty, married at 20 to a prosperous farmer, kept up a steady stream of excited chatter as the carriage rolled through town and out onto the open prairie. I've never been to the Harrington Ranch, she said, pressing her nose to the window glass. They say the house is like something out of a magazine. 20 rooms. Can you imagine? Evelyn couldn't, actually. The Moore house had 5 rooms, and that had always seemed sufficient. As they traveled, the landscape opened up before them, rolling grassland now covered in snow, stands of pine rising dark against the white, and in the distance, the mountains standing like sentinels against the gray sky. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way that Evelyn had always loved about Montana. This was a land that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. After 40 minutes, they crested a rise, and the Harrington Ranch spread out below them. Sarah gasped, and Evelyn understood why. The house was enormous, built from local stone and timber in a style that managed to be both imposing and somehow organic, as if it had grown from the land itself rather than being built upon it. It sprawled across a gentle slope, 3 stories of windows that caught the weak winter sunlight, wide porches, and chimneys from which smoke rose in lazy spirals. Behind it she could see extensive stables, corrals filled with horses, and outbuildings that suggested a working ranch of significant size. "Good heavens," Sarah breathed. "You could fit half the town in there." The carriage pulled up to the front entrance, and before they could descend, the door opened and Lucas Harrington emerged, followed by a small, fierce-looking woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything and wasn't impressed by most of it. "Miss Moore," Lucas said, offering his hand to help her down. "Thank you for coming. This is Mrs. Rodriguez, my housekeeper. She's agreed to show you around while we talk." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded at Evelyn with sharp, assessing eyes, then turned the same look on Sarah. "You must be the chaperone. Good. I've got fresh coffee and cake in the kitchen. We'll let these 2 talk books while we get acquainted." Sarah shot Evelyn a slightly panicked look, but Mrs. Rodriguez was already ushering her inside with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested resistance would be futile. Evelyn found herself alone with Lucas on the wide front porch, the wind cutting cold around them. "She's terrifying," Evelyn said before she could stop herself. Lucas actually laughed, a rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "She's been with my family since I was a boy. She's the only person who can manage to both intimidate me and make me feel completely safe at the same time." He gestured toward the door. "Shall we?" The interior of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, with a grand staircase sweeping upward and doorways leading to various rooms. But Lucas led her past all of that, down a corridor lined with landscapes and portraits, to a set of double doors at the back of the house. He paused with his hand on the door handle. "I should warn you," he said, and there was something almost vulnerable in his voice. "It's rather overwhelming. My grandfather started the collection, my father expanded it, and I've added to it considerably. But I've never properly organized any of it. Books are just piled wherever they fit." He opened the doors. Evelyn stepped inside and stopped breathing. The library occupied what must have originally been designed as a ballroom, a massive space with soaring ceilings, tall windows along one wall, and floor-to-ceiling shelves along the other 3. But the shelves were only part of the story. Books were everywhere, stacked on tables, piled on chairs, lying open on every flat surface. Some shelves were organized with care, others seemed to have been filled at random. There were novels mixed with agricultural texts, poetry beside medical journals, philosophy stacked on top of penny dreadfuls. It was chaos, beautiful, overwhelming, magnificent chaos. "Oh," Evelyn whispered, moving forward like a woman in a trance. "Oh my." She ran her fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare, pulled out a first edition of Whitman, picked up a natural history text with hand-colored illustrations. Her mind was already working, already seeing the patterns, the categories, the system that could bring order to this glorious mess. "What do you think?" Lucas asked from behind her, and she heard the genuine nervousness in his voice. "Can it be saved?" Evelyn turned to look at him, her eyes shining. "Saved? Mr. Harrington, this is the most magnificent library I've ever seen. Do you realize what you have here? Some of these are incredibly rare. This Darwin alone is worth—" She stopped herself, realizing she was probably being wildly inappropriate. But Lucas was smiling now, really smiling, and the transformation was almost painful to watch. He looked years younger, the weight of whatever grief he carried lightening just a fraction. "You really do love books," he said softly. "I really do," she admitted. This would be an honor to organize, but it will take time. Months, probably, maybe longer." "I have time." He moved closer, reaching past her to pull out a volume. "Do you know Emerson?" "Self-reliance changed my life when I was 16, Evelyn said. "My mother thought I was reading too much philosophy. She was probably right. There's no such thing as too much philosophy." Lucas opened the book, and she saw that the margins were covered in notes. His handwriting, she realized. Observations, arguments, questions. Though my wife used to disagree, she thought reading was a waste of time that could be spent on practical matters. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife, and the pain in his voice was still fresh, still raw, even after 5 years. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said quietly. I'm sorry for your loss." Lucas closed the book carefully. "Catherine died of influenza 5 years ago this past September. Everyone said I should have remarried by now, moved on, found someone suitable." His jaw tightened. As if a wife was just a position to be filled. As if love was something you could just replace. Evelyn understood then, with sudden clarity, why he'd hidden himself away, why he ignored the fluttering women and ambitious mothers. He wasn't ready to be hunted, to be pursued, to be seen as a prize to be won. "You loved her very much," she said. "I did. We married young. I was 22, she was 19. Everyone said we were too different, that it wouldn't work. But we loved each other, and we were happy, and then she was gone, and everyone wanted me to just forget. Find the next Mrs. Harrington and carry on as if she'd never existed." He set the book down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I never talk about this." "It's all right," Evelyn said gently. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who doesn't have expectations of you." Lucas looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt that strange electric sensation again, like the air before a lightning strike. "That's why I asked you," he said. "Because you don't want anything from me except to work with the books. Because you look at me and don't see my bank account or my land or my potential as a husband. You just see a person who needs help organizing his library." It should have been disappointing, Evelyn thought. She should have been hurt by the confirmation that this was purely transactional. But instead, she felt something else. Relief, maybe, and a strange kind of understanding. "I can do that," she said. "I can help you organize your library. And I promise not to have any ulterior motives beyond creating the best cataloging system Montana has ever seen." His smile was slow but genuine. "When can you start?" They spent the next hour discussing logistics. Evelyn would come 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, from 2 until 5 in the afternoon. Lucas would pay her 50 cents an hour, an outrageous sum that she tried to negotiate down before realizing he wasn't going to budge. Sarah would continue as chaperone, with Mrs. Rodriguez always present in the house as additional supervision. As Lucas walked her back to the entrance hall, Evelyn's mind was already spinning with plans. She would start with a complete inventory, then move to categorization, then to the actual shelving system. She'd need labels, probably a card catalog, maybe even... "Miss Moore?" She stopped and turned back. Lucas was standing in the doorway to the library, backlit by the windows, and for a moment he looked almost ethereal. "Thank you," he said, "for not looking at me the way everyone else does." "Thank you," she replied, "for the same." The gossip started before Evelyn's carriage had even made it back to town. By the time she arrived home, her mother had already heard from 4 different sources that Evelyn had been seen entering Lucas Harrington's house, unchaperoned, and staying for an scandalously long time. The fact that Sarah had been with her the entire time seemed irrelevant to the rumor mill. Over the following days, as word spread that Evelyn would be working at the ranch 3 times a week, the whispers grew louder and more pointed. At the general store, Mrs. Pemberton made a show of expressing concern about Evelyn's reputation. "I'm sure it's all very innocent, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But you know how people talk. A young woman spending so much time alone with a man like that. I'm organizing his library, Evelyn said through gritted teeth, with both Sarah Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez present at all times. Oh, of course, of course. It's just that some might see it as presumptuous. A woman of your position, thinking she could catch the eye of someone like Lucas Harrington. The message was clear. Know your place. Don't dream above your station. But Evelyn had never been good at staying in her place. The following Monday, she arrived at the ranch with Sarah, a notebook full of organizational plans and a determination to prove that she'd been hired for her mind, not her marriageability. Lucas met them at the door, and Evelyn noticed that he looked more rested than he had before, less haunted around the eyes. I cleared the large table for you, he said, leading them to the library, and I found some additional shelving in the attic. Pete can install it wherever you need. For the first few hours, they worked in relative silence. Evelyn had decided to start with a complete inventory, and Sarah helped her create lists while Lucas occasionally offered information about where certain books had come from. His grandfather had collected natural histories. His father had loved military strategy. Lucas himself seemed to favor philosophy, poetry, and surprisingly, agricultural innovation. You've read all of these? Evelyn asked, incredulous, as she examined his personal collection. Most of them. Reading was my escape after... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Around 4 o'clock, Mrs. Rodriguez brought tea and insisted they all take a break. As they sat around the table, Evelyn, Lucas, Sarah, and the formidable housekeeper, the conversation drifted to books they'd loved, books they'd hated, authors they wished they could meet. Sarah, who'd been mostly quiet, suddenly spoke up. I always wanted to read more, she admitted, but Mother said too much reading would make me difficult to manage, that men didn't like women who knew too much. Men who don't like educated women aren't worth knowing, Lucas said firmly, and Evelyn looked at him in surprise. That's easy for you to say, Sarah replied, not unkindly. You're a man. You can read whatever you want without anyone questioning whether it makes you less marriageable. She has a point, Evelyn said quietly. Everything I've ever learned, every book I've ever loved, has been treated as evidence of my unsuitability as a wife. Lucas set down his teacup carefully. Then the men of this town are fools. The ability to think, to question, to engage with ideas, that's not a flaw. It's the most valuable quality a person can have. Try telling that to Thomas Weatherby, Evelyn said before she could stop herself. He told me I made him feel stupid just by existing. Then Thomas Weatherby is an insecure child who needs a mirror, not a wife. The vehemence in Lucas's voice startled all of them. He looked embarrassed by his own outburst, but he didn't take it back. In that moment, sitting in the warm library with afternoon light slanting through the windows, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. It wasn't attraction, or not just attraction. It was recognition. The sense of finding someone who understood something fundamental about the world, about the way ideas mattered, about the loneliness of being told your best qualities were actually flaws. Careful, she warned herself. This is how you get hurt. But when Lucas's eyes met hers across the table, when he smiled that rare, transformative smile, she realized she might already be in trouble. Yes, over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Evelyn would arrive at the ranch with Sarah, work for 3 hours organizing, cataloging, and systematizing Lucas's magnificent chaos of a library, and then return home to her mother's increasingly pointed questions about whether anything had developed. Nothing had developed, Evelyn insisted. They were working, that was all. But it wasn't quite true. The work itself was deeply satisfying, creating order from chaos, discovering rare volumes, building a cataloging system that would have made any professional librarian proud. But it was the conversations that Evelyn found herself anticipating, looking forward to with an intensity that worried her. Lucas was brilliant, not in the flashy way of men who needed everyone to know how clever they were, but in the quiet way of someone who'd spent years thinking deeply about things that mattered. They debated philosophy over dusty poetry volumes. They discussed agricultural innovation while sorting farming manuals. They argued good-naturedly about whether Shakespeare or Marlowe was the superior playwright. He listened when she talked, really listened, engaging with her ideas as equals rather than humoring her the way most men did. He challenged her when he disagreed, but never dismissed her. And when she made a point that changed his mind, he admitted it openly. It was intoxicating. Sarah noticed, of course. One afternoon in late November, as they were riding back to town, she finally said what she'd been clearly thinking for weeks. "You're falling in love with him." Evelyn's immediate denial died on her lips. "I'm not," she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "Evelyn, I see how you look at him, how you light up when he enters the room, how you save your best stories for the workdays." "He's not interested in me that way," Evelyn said firmly. "He loved his wife. He's still grieving. And even if he weren't, I'm hardly the type of woman someone like him would—" "Stop," Sarah interrupted gently. "Stop deciding what you deserve before anyone else gets the chance. Maybe he's not ready now. Maybe he'll never be ready. But don't sell yourself short before the game's even played." But Evelyn knew better than to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment, and she'd had enough disappointment to last a lifetime. Still, she couldn't quite stop the small flutter in her chest every time Lucas smiled at her. Couldn't quite stop imagining what it might be like if Sarah was right. On the first Monday in December, everything changed. Evelyn arrived to find Lucas pacing in the library, a letter clutched in his hand and an expression of barely controlled fury on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, Sarah hovering nervously behind her. Lucas looked up, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes. Panic. "Marianne Whitlock is coming to visit," he said, his voice tight. "She'll arrive next week." The name meant nothing to Evelyn, but clearly it meant everything to Lucas. "Who is Marianne Whitlock?" Lucas sank into one of the library chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. "Catherine's best friend. We grew up together, the three of us. She's been in Europe for the past 5 years since Catherine died. And now she's coming home, and she's—" He stopped, his jaw working. "She's what?" Evelyn prompted gently. Lucas looked at her, and there was something almost like an apology in his eyes. "She's the woman everyone assumes I'll marry. The woman I was supposed to marry before I met Catherine. The woman who's been writing me letters for 5 years, waiting for me to come to my senses and realize we're perfect for each other." Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And are you perfect for each other?" "No," Lucas said immediately, vehemently. "We were friends once, yes. But she wants things I can't give her. She sees me as a project, something to fix, to manage. She thinks my grief is something to be cured rather than honored, and she's relentless." He stood abruptly, moving to the window. "She's beautiful, sophisticated, everything a man in my position should want, and she knows it." "Then why don't you want her?" The question came out smaller than Evelyn intended. Lucas turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because I don't love her. Because the thought of spending my life with someone who sees me as a fixer-upper project makes me want to run for the mountains. Because—" He stopped himself, but Evelyn could feel the weight of whatever he hadn't said hanging in the air between them. "Because what?" she whispered. But before he could answer, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Excuse me, Mr. Lucas, but there's an issue with the cattle in the north pasture that needs your attention immediately." The spell broke. Lucas nodded, his face shuddering back into its usual careful control. "Of course. Miss Moore? Miss Chen? Please make yourselves comfortable. I'll return as soon as I can." After he left, Sarah looked at Evelyn with wide eyes. "Did that feel as significant to you as it did to me?" Evelyn sank into a chair, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know. I don't know what any of this means." But deep down, in a place she didn't want to examine too closely, she was terrified that she did know. And that knowledge was going to break her heart, because Marianne Whitlock, beautiful, sophisticated, socially appropriate Marianne Whitlock, was exactly the kind of woman Lucas Harrington should choose. And Evelyn Moore, the woman no one else had wanted, was exactly the kind of woman who would be left behind when the real competition arrived. Marianne Whitlock arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a private coach that looked like it had rolled straight out of a New York Society magazine. Evelyn wasn't there to see it. Tuesday wasn't one of her work days, But by Wednesday morning, every detail had been reported, analyzed, and dissected by the women of Redwood Hollow. She was breathtaking, they said, tall and willowy, with golden hair arranged in the latest fashion and a wardrobe that must have cost more than most families earned in a year. She'd swept into the Harrington Ranch like she owned it, kissing Lucas on both cheeks in the European manner, calling him darling with easy familiarity. Mrs. Pemberton had somehow gotten the story from one of the ranch hands who'd come into town for supplies. She shared it with anyone who would listen, standing in the general store while Evelyn pretended to reorganize stock that was already perfectly organized. They looked so natural together, Mrs. Pemberton gushed, like they were made for each other, and you should have seen the way she touched his arm, so comfortable, so intimate. Mark my words, there'll be a wedding announcement before spring. Evelyn's hands tightened on the bolt of fabric she was holding, but she kept her face carefully neutral. This was none of her business. Lucas was her employer, nothing more. What he did with his personal life, who he chose to spend time with, was entirely his affair. But when Wednesday afternoon came and Sarah arrived at the Moore house to accompany her to the ranch, Evelyn found herself fighting the urge to feign illness and stay home. You can't avoid her forever, Sarah said gently, as if reading her mind. And besides, you have a job to do. Don't let some fancy woman from back east chase you away from work you love. Sarah was right, of course. Evelyn had never been a coward, and she wasn't going to start now. The carriage ride to the ranch felt longer than usual, every mile giving Evelyn more time to imagine what she'd find when she arrived. Would Mary Ann be draped across the library furniture, interrupting their work with charming anecdotes from Paris? Would Lucas be different with her there, more animated, more alive, more like the man he must have been before grief carved away pieces of his soul? When they arrived, Lucas was waiting on the porch as usual, but he looked tense, his shoulders tight with barely suppressed stress. "Miss Moore, Miss Chen," he said, his voice formal in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "Thank you for coming. I should warn you that we have a guest, and she's expressed interest in meeting you." Before Evelyn could respond, the front door opened and Mary Ann Whitlock appeared. The gossips hadn't exaggerated. She was stunning in a way that made Evelyn immediately conscious of her own plain wool dress and practical boots. Mary Ann wore silk the color of champagne, her hair arranged in artful curls, her posture so perfect it looked like she'd been trained by ballet masters. But it was her eyes that caught Evelyn's attention, intelligent, calculating, missing nothing. "So this is the famous Miss Moore," Mary Ann said, gliding forward with a smile that didn't quite reach those sharp eyes. "Lucas has told me all about your little project with his books. How wonderfully industrious of you." The condescension in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. This woman had already sized Evelyn up and dismissed her as irrelevant. "Mrs. Whitlock," Evelyn said, keeping her voice level, "it's a pleasure to meet you. Please, call me Mary Ann. We're all friends here, after all." She linked her arm through Lucas's with easy possession, and Evelyn saw him stiffen slightly. "I've been simply dying to see what you've done with the library. Lucas says you've worked miracles, though I told him any competent person could organize books. It's not exactly complex work." Sarah made a small noise that might have been a cough or might have been a stifled protest. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, but refused to take the bait. "Shall we get started then?" she said, directing her words to Lucas rather than Mary Ann. They moved to the library, and Evelyn felt a small surge of satisfaction when Mary Ann's perfectly composed expression flickered with surprise at the sight of the transformed space. In the weeks since Evelyn had started, she'd created order from chaos. Shelves were now organized by category and alphabetized within each section. She'd implemented a card catalog system and created beautiful hand-lettered labels for each shelf. The room still had the warmth and character of a personal library, but now it was also functional and searchable. "My goodness," Mary Ann said, recovering quickly. "How very thorough. Though I'm not sure all this fuss was necessary. Lucas isn't exactly going to be searching for specific titles, are you, darling?" "Actually, I use the catalog constantly," Lucas said, his voice tight. "Miss Moore has made it possible for me to actually find what I'm looking for instead of spending hours hunting." "How practical," Mary Ann replied, the word somehow managing to sound like an insult. She wandered over to one of the shelves, running a manicured finger along the spines. "Though I must say, I'm surprised to see such modern organizational methods in a frontier ranch. Surely there are more pressing concerns than categorizing books. The ranch must need attention. The business must need managing. A man in your position can't afford to spend all his time playing with libraries. I find time for what matters to me, Lucas said quietly, but there was steel underneath the words. Marianne's laugh was light and musical. Of course you do, darling. You always were stubborn about the strangest things. It's one of your most endearing qualities. She turned to Evelyn with a smile that was all teeth. I hope you don't mind if I stay while you work. I'm simply fascinated by the process. What Evelyn minded was irrelevant. This was Lucas's house, and Marianne was clearly his guest. Of course not, she said, moving to the desk where she'd left her notes from the previous session. The next 2 hours were excruciating. Marianne positioned herself in one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, ostensibly reading a novel but actually watching everything Evelyn did with hawk-like attention. She interrupted constantly with questions that sounded innocent but were clearly designed to undermine. Is that really the most efficient way to catalog? I knew a librarian in Boston who used a completely different system. Are you sure those books belong in that category? It seems rather subjective. Shouldn't someone with actual professional training be doing this kind of work? Evelyn answered each question with polite professionalism, but she could feel her jaw getting tighter with each interruption. Sarah, relegated to a corner with Mrs. Rodriguez and a pot of tea, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Lucas, for his part, seemed miserable. He tried several times to engage Evelyn in their usual conversations about the books they were organizing, but Marianne always found a way to redirect the conversation back to herself and her experiences in Europe. Finally, as Evelyn was cataloging a particularly rare collection of botanical illustrations, Lucas's patience snapped. "Marianne," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the parlor. I'm sure Miss Moore finds your presence distracting." Marianne's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in her eyes. "Nonsense, darling. I'm perfectly comfortable here. Besides, I want to learn all about Miss Moore's methods. After all, once we're settled, I'll need to understand how the library works." The presumption in those words, "once we're settled," hung in the air like gun smoke. Evelyn's hand stilled on the book she was holding. She couldn't look at Lucas, couldn't bear to see whether he'd challenge Marianne's assumption or let it stand uncorrected. "That's not—" Lucas started, but Marianne cut him off smoothly. "Oh, don't be coy, darling. Everyone knows it's just a matter of time. We've wasted 5 years already. Catherine wouldn't have wanted you to mourn forever." Her voice softened on Catherine's name, taking on a tone of sorrowful understanding that somehow felt calculated. "She was my dearest friend, and I know she'd want you to be happy again, with someone appropriate, someone who understands your world." The emphasis on appropriate was subtle, but unmistakable. Evelyn felt the words like a slap. "You didn't know what Catherine wanted," Lucas said, his voice harder than Evelyn had ever heard it. "And I'll thank you not to speak for her." "I knew her better than anyone except you," Marianne replied, unfazed by his anger. "We grew up together, remember? I was there through everything, your courtship, your marriage, her illness. I held your hand at her funeral while you couldn't even speak." It was a power play, Evelyn realized. Marianne was establishing her claim through shared history, through her position as keeper of Lucas's grief. How could anyone compete with that? "Miss Moore," Lucas said suddenly, turning to her with something almost like desperation in his eyes. "What did you think of the Wordsworth collection we discussed last week? The one with the handwritten notes?" It was a lifeline, an attempt to pull the conversation back to safer ground. Evelyn grasped it gratefully. "The annotations are fascinating," she said, finding her professional voice. "Particularly the commentary on Tintern Abbey. Whoever wrote them had a deep understanding of—" "Oh, poetry," Marianne interrupted with a delicate yawn. "How tedious. Surely we can discuss something more interesting. Lucas, tell me about the new breeding program you mentioned in your letter. The one with the Herefords?" And just like that, she dismissed both Evelyn and the work she was doing as beneath notice. The afternoon dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. By the time 5 o'clock arrived and Sarah stood to leave, Evelyn felt wrung out and hollow. Lucas walked them to the door while Marianne remained in the library, presumably to give them a moment of privacy that she'd already poisoned with her presence. "I'm sorry," Lucas said quietly once they were in the entrance hall. This isn't what I wanted." "It's fine," Evelyn lied, pulling on her gloves with hands that weren't quite steady. "She's your guest. You don't need to apologize for her." "I do, though." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "She has no right to speak to you the way she did. No right to make assumptions about—" He stopped himself, glancing toward the library. "Will you come back Friday, please?" The please broke something in Evelyn's chest. He looked so tired, so trapped, and she realized that whatever Marianne wanted, Lucas didn't want it. At least, not yet. "I'll be here," she said. "The catalog isn't finished." The relief on his face was palpable, but it was quickly replaced by something more complicated when Marianne appeared in the hallway, slipping her arm through his again with practiced ease. "Leaving already, Miss Moore? Well, I'm sure we'll see you Friday. Lucas and I have so many plans to make before then. Estate business, you understand. The responsibilities of managing a property this size are quite overwhelming for one person. It really requires a partner who understands these matters." The message was clear. Marianne saw herself as that partner, and she was already planning to make Evelyn's position redundant. In the carriage ride home, Sarah was uncharacteristically quiet until they were nearly back to town. Then she said very carefully, "That was the most unpleasant woman I've ever met." Despite everything, Evelyn laughed, a short, bitter sound. "She's beautiful, though, and sophisticated. Everything a man like Lucas should want." "She's a viper in a silk dress," Sarah corrected firmly, "and I saw the way Lucas looked at her versus the way he looks at you. There's no warmth there, Evelyn, no connection. He's tolerating her, not welcoming her." "It doesn't matter," Evelyn said, even though the small flame of hope Sarah's words kindled in her chest suggested otherwise. "She has history with him, shared grief, social standing. What do I have? Books I've organized." "You have his respect," Sarah said quietly, "and maybe more than that, even if neither of you is ready to admit it." But respect wasn't enough, Evelyn thought, not against a woman who'd already decided Lucas belonged to her. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Evelyn made herself face the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. She'd fallen in love with Lucas Harrington. It was foolish and hopeless and entirely inappropriate. He was her employer. He was grieving. He was being pursued by a woman far more suitable than Evelyn would ever be. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she needed to protect her heart, to maintain professional distance, to remember her place. But her heart, irrational and stubborn, didn't care about any of that. She loved the way his face lit up when they discussed a particularly interesting passage. She loved his rare, transformative smiles and the way he listened to her ideas as if they mattered. She loved his quiet intelligence, his grief that he wore honestly instead of hiding, his refusal to pretend to be something he wasn't. And it was going to destroy her when he chose Marianne. The next 2 days crawled by. Evelyn threw herself into work at the general store, reorganizing inventory that didn't need reorganizing, helping customers with excessive enthusiasm, anything to keep her mind occupied. But her mother's worried glances and pointed questions about what happened at the ranch made it clear she wasn't fooling anyone. Friday arrived cold and clear, the Montana sky that particular shade of blue that made everything feel sharp-edged and fragile. Evelyn dressed with extra care, then changed twice, furious with herself for caring what she looked like. This was work, just work. Sarah was quiet during the carriage ride, offering moral support through presence rather than words. When they arrived, Mrs. Rodriguez met them at the door instead of Lucas, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sympathetic. "Mr. Lucas is in his study with Mrs. Whitlock," she said. "He asked that you begin without him. He'll join you when he can." The library felt empty without Lucas's presence, despite the books surrounding her. Evelyn tried to focus on her work. She was nearly finished with the main catalog and wanted to start on the specialized collections, but her attention kept drifting to the closed study door down the hall. What were they discussing in there? Wedding plans? The future of the ranch? When Evelyn should finish her work and stop coming around? An hour passed. Then another. Sarah helped where she could, but the silence grew heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, around 3:30, raised voices filtered down the hallway. Evelyn couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Lucas angry, Marianne imperious, and insistent. Then a door slammed and rapid footsteps approached the library. Marianne swept in, her perfect composure slightly cracked, spots of angry color high on her cheeks. She stopped when she saw Evelyn, and something vicious flashed across her face before she regained control. "Still here, I see," she said coldly. "How dedicated you are to your little project." "I'm being paid to do a job," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice steady. "I intend to do it well." "Of course you do. How very professional." Marianne moved closer, her voice dropping to a tone that was almost conversational. "Let me be frank with you, Miss Moore. Lucas is going through a difficult time. He's been alone too long, and he's confused about what he needs. He thinks he wants solitude and books and intellectual conversation, but what he actually needs is someone who can help him move forward. Someone from his own world who understands the demands of his position." "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying," Evelyn said, though she understood perfectly. "I think you do." Marianne's smile was sharp. "I've seen the way you look at him. It's quite transparent, really. But you must realize how inappropriate it is. A shopkeeper's daughter entertaining romantic notions about one of the wealthiest men in the territory. It's embarrassing for everyone involved." The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its casualness. This was how Marianne saw her, as something pitiable and presumptuous, reaching above her station. "I'm here to organize books," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the sick feeling in her stomach. "Nothing more." "How admirable that you can lie so convincingly," Marianne replied. "But here's the truth. Lucas and I have known each other since we were children. Our families have been connected for generations. We share a history, a social circle, a way of life that you couldn't possibly understand. What you offer him, filing systems and literary discussions, is a pleasant diversion at best, but it's not what he needs. It's not what a man like him builds a life on." Before Evelyn could respond, Lucas appeared in the doorway. His eyes swept the scene, Marianne standing too close to Evelyn, the tension thick enough to cut, and his jaw tightened. "Marianne," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "A word, now." Marianne's expression shifted instantly, becoming soft and slightly wounded. "Darling, I was just getting to know Miss Moore better, making conversation." "Now," Lucas repeated, and the steel in his voice left no room for argument. Marianne swept past him with her head high, and Lucas followed, but not before shooting Evelyn a look that might have been an apology or a warning or both. Sarah materialized at Evelyn's elbow. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Evelyn said automatically, then amended, "No, I'm not fine, but I will be." They heard more raised voices from down the hall, louder this time. Lucas's voice saying something sharp about completely inappropriate. Marianne's response, something about telling the truth and saving you from making a mistake. Then silence. When Lucas finally returned to the library, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly, and there was a muscle jumping in his jaw. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Several, actually. Marianne had no right to speak to you that way. No right to make assumptions or implications or—" He stopped, taking a breath. "I've asked her to leave." Evelyn's eyes widened. "You've asked her to leave the ranch?" "Yes, she'll be gone by tomorrow morning." Lucas moved to the window, staring out at the winter landscape. "I should have done it days ago. Should have made it clear from the beginning that whatever she expected from this visit, it wasn't going to happen. But I was trying to be kind, trying to honor our old friendship, and instead, I let her hurt you." "I'm your employee," Evelyn said carefully. "You don't need to protect me from uncomfortable conversations." Lucas turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "You're not just my employee. You're—" He stopped himself, glancing at Sarah, who was trying very hard to appear invisible in the corner. "We've become friends, haven't we? These past weeks?" "I'd like to think so," Evelyn said softly. "Then, as your friend, I'm telling you that everything Marianne said was poisonous nonsense designed to make you doubt yourself." He took a step closer. "You're not inappropriate or presumptuous or any of the other things she implied. You're brilliant and capable, and you've brought life back to this house in a way I didn't think was possible anymore." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that Evelyn didn't quite dare to interpret. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you know." Lucas nodded, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. "She'll try to cause trouble as she leaves, spread gossip, make insinuations. I want you to be prepared for that. The town will talk." "The town always talks," Evelyn said with a bitter smile. "I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be." The anger in his voice wasn't directed at her, but at the world that had decided she was less than she was. "None of this is fair to you." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged with things unsaid. Then Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway with tea, breaking the spell, and the afternoon resumed its normal rhythm. But everything had changed, and they all knew it. True to Lucas's prediction, Mary Ann's departure the next morning became immediate fodder for Redwood Hollow's gossip mill. By Sunday, the story had grown elaborate wings. Mary Ann had caught Lucas and Evelyn in a compromising position. Mary Ann had discovered that Lucas had been secretly courting the shopkeeper's daughter. Mary Ann had heroically exposed Evelyn's scheming attempts to trap a wealthy husband. The version that seemed to gain the most traction was that Evelyn had used her position to seduce Lucas, taking advantage of his grief and loneliness to worm her way into his affections. It was, after all, the most dramatic version, and drama was currency in a small town. Evelyn endured the whispers and sidelong glances with the same quiet dignity she'd perfected over years of being the woman no one wanted. But it hurt more this time because now she had something to lose. Her mother confronted her Sunday evening after church, her face drawn with worry. "People are saying terrible things, Evelyn. They're saying you've been behaving improperly with Mr. Harrington, that you've been alone with him without proper supervision." "Sarah has been there every single time," Evelyn said wearily. "And Mrs. Rodriguez, there has never been a moment of impropriety." "But people don't care about the truth," her mother said desperately. "They care about the appearance. And the appearance is that a woman of your position has been spending hours alone with one of the wealthiest men in the territory, and his former intended has left in disgrace." "She wasn't his intended," Evelyn protested. "She was his late wife's friend who assumed too much." "It doesn't matter what she was," her mother said. "What matters is what people believe. And they believe that you've overstepped, that you've forgotten your place." There it was again. Her place. The invisible boundaries that dictated who she could speak to, what work she could do, what hopes she was allowed to have. "I'm going to keep working at the ranch," Evelyn said quietly but firmly. "I have a job to finish, and I'm going to finish it." Her mother's face crumpled. "Oh, Evelyn, what if this ruins what few chances you have left? What if no decent man will ever want you now?" The question would have devastated Evelyn a year ago. But now, after weeks of intellectual partnership with Lucas, after discovering what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than dismissed for it, the question just made her tired. "Then I'll be ruined," she said. "But at least I'll have spent my time doing work that matters to me with someone who respects me. That's more than most marriages offer." When Monday came, Evelyn returned to the ranch with her head high and her resolve firm. Whatever gossip followed her, whatever judgment the town passed, she would finish what she'd started. Lucas met her at the door, and she could see the question in his eyes. Would she come back? Had Mary Ann's poison worked? "The catalog is almost complete," Evelyn said before he could ask. "I thought today we could start on the specialized collections. The natural histories in particular need attention." The relief on his face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "I was afraid that—" He stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. You're here." They worked side by side that afternoon, and for the first time since Mary Ann's arrival, the easy companionship they'd built returned. They debated the proper categorization of books that straddled multiple disciplines. They discovered a first edition of Darwin that made them both gasp with excitement. They laughed over a ridiculous agricultural manual that suggested training chickens to perform simple mathematics. It was perfect. It was exactly what Evelyn had missed. And it was ending. She realized it with sudden, painful clarity as she watched Lucas carefully reshelving a volume. The catalog was almost done. Another few weeks, maybe a month, and her work here would be finished. There would be no reason for her to return. The thought left her hollow. "What are you thinking?" Lucas asked, catching her staring. "That this will be over soon," she said honestly. "The organizing. Once the catalog is complete and everything is properly shelved, you won't need me anymore." Lucas set down the book he was holding very carefully. "What if I don't want it to be over?" Evelyn's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "The library was just an excuse, Evelyn. Surely you've realized that by now." She stared at him. "An excuse for what?" "To have you here. To talk to you, spend time with you, to—" He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with honesty. "To not be alone anymore." The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. "Lucas," Evelyn said carefully, "you've been grieving. You're lonely. That's natural. But I'm not. I can't be just a remedy for loneliness." "You're not," he said immediately. "That's not what I'm saying. You're—" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "You're the first person in 5 years who's made me want to be present in my own life again, who's made me remember that there are things worth caring about beyond grief and duty. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" "I'm not sure," Evelyn whispered, because hope was a dangerous thing, and she'd been hurt too many times to trust it easily. "Then let me be clearer." Lucas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His touch was warm and solid and real. "I care about you, Evelyn Moore, not as an employee, not as a convenient companion, as someone I admire and respect and—" He swallowed hard. "And want in my life, if you'll have me." It was everything she'd secretly hoped for, and everything she'd told herself not to want. The sensible part of her brain screamed warnings about scandal and social position, and the impossibility of what he was suggesting. But her heart, stubborn and brave, had other ideas. "The town will crucify me," she said. "They already think I'm scheming to trap you. If this becomes something real, they'll say I've succeeded." "Then let them say it," Lucas replied. "I'm tired of living my life according to what other people think I should do. Tired of pretending that wealth and social position matter more than genuine connection. I want—" He stopped, searching her face. "What do you want, Evelyn?" It was the question no one had ever asked her before. Not what she should want or what was appropriate for someone of her station to want, but what she actually desired. "I want this," she said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. "I want to keep coming here, keep working with the books, keep having these conversations that make me feel like my mind matters. I want—" She hesitated, then decided if she was going to risk everything, she might as well risk it completely. "I want you, but I don't know how to want that without everything else falling apart." Lucas's smile was slow and warm and absolutely devastating. "Then we'll figure it out together. One day at a time. No promises we're not ready to make, no expectations beyond what we both choose freely. Just this. Us. Is that enough for now?" It was more than enough. It was everything. "Yes," Evelyn said, and when Lucas squeezed her hand gently, she felt something that had been locked tight in her chest for years finally begin to unfurl. They were still holding hands when Sarah cleared her throat from the doorway, her eyes dancing with barely suppressed delight. "I hate to interrupt," she said, not sounding like she hated it at all. "But Mrs. Rodriguez wanted me to remind you that appearances do still matter, even if we're deciding to be brave. So perhaps a bit more distance while I'm pretending to chaperone?" They sprang apart like guilty children, and Evelyn felt her cheeks flame. But Lucas was laughing, really laughing, the sound rich and genuine, and the joy in it made everything worth it. The walls that had protected her were crumbling, and beyond them lay something terrifying and wonderful. Whatever came next, scandal, judgment, the town's crushing disapproval, Evelyn would face it, because for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her, not despite who she was, but because of it. And she was choosing him right back. The shift between them was subtle but unmistakable. They didn't hold hands again, didn't exchange forbidden glances across the library, didn't do anything that could be pointed to as evidence of impropriety. But the air itself seemed different, charged with possibility and the sweet terror of wanting something that might actually be within reach. Over the next 2 weeks, their work continued with a new dimension woven beneath it. Lucas would hand her a book, and their fingers would brush, and the contact would linger half a second longer than necessary. She would explain her cataloging system and catch him watching her face instead of the cards she was showing him. They talked about everything: politics and philosophy, agricultural innovations and poetry, the future of the Montana Territory, and whether the railroad expansion would ruin or revive small towns like Redwood Hollow. Sarah played her role as chaperone with theatrical dedication, sitting in the corner with her needlework and occasionally coughing meaningfully when Lucas leaned too close or Evelyn's laugh grew too warm. But even she couldn't suppress her smiles when she thought they weren't looking. The town, meanwhile, had moved from whispers to something more pointed. Mrs. Pemberton and her circle of friends made sure to visit the general store frequently, their conversations designed to be overheard. They spoke of poor judgment and unseemly ambition, and wondered aloud what Lucas Harrington's late wife would think if she could see how quickly he'd forgotten her. They never said Evelyn's name directly, but the target was clear. Her mother grew increasingly anxious, jumping at every ring of the doorbell, certain it would be the town council demanding they explain themselves. Her father, normally mild-mannered to a fault, surprised Evelyn by defending her over Sunday dinner. "She's doing honest work," Thomas More said firmly, cutting his pot roast with more force than necessary. "Organizing a man's library isn't a crime, and anyone who says otherwise can take their business elsewhere." "But Thomas," her mother protested weakly, "let them talk," he said, and Evelyn felt a surge of love for this quiet man who'd given her his head for numbers and his stubborn dignity. "Our daughter has more sense in her little finger than half this town has in their collective heads. If Lucas Harrington values her enough to hire her, that speaks well of both of them." It was the most support Evelyn had received from anyone besides Sarah, and it fortified her against the cold shoulders and pointed looks that followed her through town. But the real storm was still gathering on the horizon. It broke on a Friday afternoon in mid-December, 2 days before Christmas, when Evelyn arrived at the ranch to find 3 horses tied outside that didn't belong to Lucas's usual staff. Mrs. Rodriguez met her at the door with a grim expression. "Mr. Lucas has visitors," she said quietly. "Town council, Reverend Thomas, Mayor Blackwood, and Harold Chen." Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Harold Chen was Sarah's husband, a good man but easily swayed by public opinion. If even he had joined this delegation, things were worse than she'd thought. "What do they want?" Mrs. Rodriguez's mouth pressed into a thin line. "You, miss. They want to discuss the situation with Mr. Lucas. I told them you weren't here yet, but I'll wait in the library," Evelyn said quickly. She wasn't going to run away, but she also wasn't going to force a confrontation that Lucas should handle on his own. Sarah had stayed in the carriage, pleading a headache, but Evelyn suspected she'd simply wanted to avoid facing her husband in this context. Now Evelyn wished she'd accepted that same cowardice. The library felt like a sanctuary, but even its familiar comfort couldn't settle the anxiety twisting in her chest. She tried to focus on her work. She'd been cataloging Lucas's collection of American poetry, but her hands shook as she wrote, and the voices from down the hall kept penetrating her concentration. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear tones. Reverend Thomas's pompous baritone, laying down moral pronouncements. Mayor Blackwood's politician's smoothness, trying to sound reasonable while making unreasonable demands. And underneath it all, Lucas's voice, harder and colder than she'd ever heard it. 20 minutes passed. 30. The voices grew louder, more heated. Then footsteps in the hall, rapid and purposeful, and suddenly Lucas was in the library doorway with 3 men crowding behind him. "There she is," Reverend Thomas said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Miss Moore, we'd like to speak with you if we may." Lucas moved to block them, his body language protective. "I told you, this is my home, and Miss Moore is here at my invitation. You have no right to interrogate her." "We're not interrogating anyone," Mayor Blackwood said smoothly, though his eyes on Evelyn were calculating. "We're simply concerned citizens looking after the well-being of one of our own. Miss Moore is a member of our community, and we feel responsible for ensuring she's not placed in a compromising position." "How thoughtful," Evelyn said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "Though I don't recall asking for your protection." Harold Chen winced, but Reverend Thomas drew himself up like a rooster preparing to crow. Young lady, we're trying to save your reputation. What's left of it? Surely you understand how this looks. An unmarried woman spending hours alone with a man. She's never alone, Lucas cut in sharply. Mrs. Rodriguez is always present, as is Miss Chen. Every propriety has been observed. Technicalities, the Reverend waved his hand dismissively. The appearance is what matters, and the appearance is that Miss Moore has been inappropriately familiar with a man far above her station, using her employment as an excuse to pursue him. The casual cruelty of it struck Evelyn like a physical blow. Not just the accusation of scheming, but the reminder that she was far below Lucas's station, that any connection between them was inherently inappropriate simply because of her birth. That's enough, Lucas said, his voice dangerous. You will not speak to her that way in my home. We're speaking to her for her own good, Mayor Blackwood interjected, trying to sound reasonable. Mr. Harrington, we understand that you've been alone for a long time, that grief can make a man vulnerable to misplaced affections. But you must see that pursuing anything with Miss Moore would be disastrous for both of you. For her reputation, for your social standing. My social standing? Lucas laughed, the sound bitter. I've spent 5 years being hounded by every ambitious mother and calculating debutante in the territory, and suddenly my social standing matters when I choose to spend time with someone I actually respect? It's precisely because you respect her that you should end this, Reverend Thomas said, switching tactics. If you care about Miss Moore at all, you'll protect her from scandal, send her home, end this employment, and allow her to rebuild what remains of her reputation. Evelyn felt something crack inside her. They were doing it again, deciding what was best for her without asking what she wanted, dismissing her agency in her own life. No, she said clearly. All 4 men turned to look at her. I beg your pardon? The Reverend sputtered. I said no. Evelyn stood, setting down her pen with deliberate precision. You don't get to decide what's best for me. You don't get to dictate my employment or my friendships or anything else about my life. Miss Moore, Mayor Blackwood started, but she cut him off. For 26 years, I've listened to this town tell me what I should be. More pleasant, less educated, quieter, smaller, more willing to diminish myself so that mediocre men could feel superior. Her voice was shaking now, but not with fear, with rage that had been building for years. I've watched you pity me for being unmarried while simultaneously ensuring no decent man would want a woman with opinions. I've heard your whispered comments about my plain face and sharp tongue. I've accepted that I'm the woman nobody chose. She looked at Lucas then, drawing strength from the fierce pride in his eyes. But I won't accept you telling me that when someone finally does choose me, when someone values my mind and my company and treats me as an equal, that it's inappropriate, that I should reject it for the sake of a reputation you've already shredded with your gossip. This is exactly the kind of unbecoming behavior we're concerned about, Reverend Thomas said, his face reddening. This defiance, this lack of proper humility. Then be concerned somewhere else, Lucas said flatly, because Miss Moore is absolutely right. Her employment here is honest work. Her conduct has been beyond reproach, and the only impropriety has been your presumption in demanding otherwise. Harold Chen cleared his throat uncomfortably. Lucas, be reasonable. We're not trying to cause trouble, but you must see that continuing this arrangement without proper supervision will only fuel more gossip. If you were to hire a second chaperone, perhaps an older woman of unquestionable reputation, so we're to be supervised like children? Evelyn demanded. With witnesses to confirm we're not holding hands between the bookshelves? It would protect you both, the mayor said. Surely that's worth a small inconvenience? Or, Lucas said, his voice carrying an edge that made them all pause, you could all leave my property and stop concerning yourselves with my private affairs. The 3 men exchanged glances. Some unspoken communication passed between them, and Reverend Thomas's expression hardened. Very well, he said stiffly. We've done what we could to guide you toward proper behavior. If you choose to ignore our counsel, the consequences are on your own heads. But know this, Mr. Harrington, the community will not stand by while one of its daughters is ruined by misplaced affection from a man who should know better. Miss Moore is not being ruined, Lucas said through gritted teeth. She's being employed. There's a difference. For now, the Reverend said ominously, but we'll be watching. And at the first sign of true impropriety, not employment, Mr. Harrington, but actual misconduct, we will intervene more forcefully. The church has certain authorities in matters of moral behavior. It was a threat, thinly veiled. The church could bring social pressure that even Lucas's wealth couldn't entirely deflect. The three men left in a cloud of righteous indignation, and Lucas stood rigid in the doorway until he heard the front door close behind them. Then he turned to Evelyn, and she saw that his hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that." "You defended me," Evelyn said, still processing what had just happened. "In front of the mayor and the Reverend, you defended me." "Of course I did." "They had no right." He broke off, running both hands through his hair. "This is my fault. I should have been more careful, should have anticipated that they'd—" "Stop," Evelyn interrupted. "Stop apologizing for other people's cruelty. You didn't make them come here. You didn't make them think they had the right to dictate my choices." "But they're not entirely wrong," Lucas said heavily. He moved to the window, staring out at the winter landscape. "Being seen with me has damaged your reputation. Whatever we tell ourselves about the innocence of our friendship, the town has already judged you. And it will only get worse if we continue." Evelyn felt cold fear settle in her stomach. "Are you saying you want to end my employment?" "No," he said immediately, turning back to face her. "No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying—" He struggled for words. "I'm saying that I care about you too much to let you be destroyed by association with me. If continuing means you'll be ostracized, that no decent family will receive you, that your chances at any kind of normal life are ruined." "What normal life?" Evelyn demanded. "The one where I marry some man who wants me to be less than I am? Where I spend my days pretending to be stupid so he can feel clever? That's not a life, Lucas. That's a prison sentence with a marriage certificate. But at least you'd be accepted, respected. You'd have security, a family of your own. I don't want those things if I have to become someone else to get them." Evelyn moved closer to him, desperate to make him understand. "These past weeks, working here with you, being able to use my mind without apology, this is the first time I've felt like myself. Like I matter. Do you really think I'd give that up to appease people who've never valued me anyway?" Lucas looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes, between what he wanted and what he thought was right, between his own desires and his sense of responsibility. "What if I offered you something else?" he said quietly. Evelyn's heart stuttered. "What do you mean? What if—" He stopped, took a breath, started again. "The Reverend was right about one thing. The appearance matters, even when we know the reality is innocent. As long as you're my employee, there will always be whispers, always suspicion. But if you were something else—" "Lucas," Evelyn said carefully, hardly daring to hope she understood what he was suggesting. "What are you asking?" He crossed to her in 2 long strides, taking both her hands in his. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Evelyn stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was pity or duty or desperation rather than genuine desire. "You're proposing," she said stupidly. "Yes. Or I'm trying to. I'm doing it badly." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I should probably be on my knee. My mother would be horrified by my lack of romance." "Lucas, stop." Evelyn pulled her hands free, needing space to think. "You can't propose to me just to solve a social problem. That's not a reason to marry someone." "It's not just that," he said urgently. "Evelyn, I've been alone for 5 years. I thought I wanted to stay that way. Thought I'd never feel anything for anyone again. But then you walked into my library and argued with me about proper alphabetization methods, and something shifted. You make me want to be present in my life again. You make me laugh. You challenge me intellectually in ways I didn't even realize I'd been craving. Is that enough? Is that love? I don't know. I'm not sure I know what love is anymore, but I know I want you in my life permanently, and I know that marriage would solve both the social problem and give me what I want. Is that so terrible? It should have been romantic. It should have been everything she'd secretly dreamed of during those long, lonely weeks of falling for him. But something about it felt wrong. You don't love me, Evelyn said, and the words hurt to speak. You care about me, yes. You respect me. You enjoy my company, but you don't love me the way you loved Catherine. You're not ready to love anyone that way. Lucas flinched as if she'd struck him. Catherine has been gone for 5 years. And you still wear your wedding ring, Evelyn said gently, gesturing to the gold band on his left hand that she'd noticed but never mentioned. You still keep her portrait on your desk. You still can't say her name without that look of pain crossing your face. I'm not asking you to forget her, Lucas. I would never ask that, but I can't marry you knowing I'd be a convenient solution rather than a genuine choice. You're not convenient, he protested. You're magnificent. You're the strongest, most brilliant woman I've ever met. How is that convenient? Because you need someone to make the gossip stop. Someone to fill the empty spaces in your house. Someone to talk to about books and ideas so you don't have to be alone anymore. Evelyn felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Those are real needs, and I don't fault you for them. But they're not the same as love. And I won't marry you, won't marry anyone, unless they choose me because they can't imagine their life without me. Not because I solve a problem they're facing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. You're refusing me, Lucas said finally, his voice hollow. I'm asking you to wait, Evelyn corrected, to give us both time to figure out what this really is. If in 6 months or a year you still want to marry me, if you've had time to grieve properly and move forward and you still choose me, then ask me again. And I'll say yes so fast it'll make your head spin. But the gossip? Let them gossip, Evelyn said with more bravery than she felt. I've survived their judgment this long. I can survive a bit longer. Lucas looked at her with something that might have been admiration or might have been despair. You're asking me to let you be ruined on the possibility that I might eventually be ready to love you properly. That's not fair to you. Life hasn't been fair to me since I turned 16 and started having opinions, Evelyn said wryly. I'm used to it. Before Lucas could respond, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, looking grim. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but there's a situation you both need to know about. Mrs. Whitlock has returned to town. Evelyn felt ice slide down her spine. Marianne is back? Arrived this morning on the stage from Billings. She's taken a room at the hotel, and she's been holding court in the dining room all afternoon. Mrs. Rodriguez's expression was troubled. Pete heard from his cousin who works there. She's telling quite a story about what happened here, about why she really left. What kind of story? Lucas demanded. The kind that makes you look like a villain, and Miss Moore look like a scheming temptress who came between two people who were meant to be together. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed her arms. She's claiming you two have been carrying on an affair for months, that she caught you together and tried to save you both from scandal, but you threw her out to continue your indiscretion. That's absolutely false, Lucas said flatly. Truth doesn't matter when the lie is more interesting, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. And Mrs. Whitlock is very good at making her lies interesting. Evelyn sank into his chair, her earlier bravado crumbling. This was worse than simple gossip. This was a coordinated attack on her character, her morals, her very right to exist in polite society. Why is she doing this? She asked quietly. Because you took what she thought was hers, Mrs. Rodriguez said bluntly. She spent 5 years positioning herself as the future Mrs. Harrington, and you disrupted those plans. Now she's making sure you pay for it. I need to confront her, Lucas said, already moving toward the door. I need to make her retract these lies. That'll only make it worse, Evelyn said wearily. If you rush to defend me, it'll look like confirmation that there's something to defend. The town will say you're blinded by infatuation, that you can't see how I've manipulated you. Then what do we do? Lucas demanded, frustration evident in every line of his body. We continue as we have been, Evelyn said, even though the thought made her want to weep. I finish the catalog. I conduct myself with absolute propriety. I give them no ammunition to use against me. While Marianne shreds your reputation piece by piece? Lucas shook his head. No, I won't let that happen. You don't have a choice, Evelyn said softly. Neither of us do. The more you defend me, the guiltier we look. The only thing we can do is weather this storm and hope the truth eventually becomes clear. But even as she said it, Evelyn wasn't sure she believed it. Marianne Whitlock had money, social standing, and the sympathy of a town that had already decided Evelyn was an upstart who'd forgotten her place. How could truth compete with that? The next few days proved Evelyn's worst fears accurate. Marianne's version of events spread through Redwood Hollow like wildfire, each retelling adding new salacious details. By the time Evelyn heard the stories third hand, she barely recognized herself in them. In Marianne's telling, Evelyn had deliberately pursued Lucas, using her position at the general store to learn his habits and preferences. She'd maneuvered the library job through careful manipulation, then spent months slowly seducing him, taking advantage of his grief and loneliness. When Marianne had arrived and discovered the affair, she'd tried to reason with Lucas, to remind him of his true feelings for her, but Evelyn had poisoned him against his oldest friend. It was a masterful piece of fiction, explaining away every inconvenient fact while painting Evelyn as calculating and immoral. And the town, primed by weeks of existing gossip, accepted it eagerly. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Customers who'd patronized the general store for years found reasons to shop elsewhere. Women who'd always been coldly polite now crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. At church on Sunday, the family's usual pew remained conspicuously empty around them, as if scandal might be contagious. Evelyn's mother stopped leaving the house except when absolutely necessary, her face drawn with shame that Evelyn knew wasn't really about her daughter's behavior, but about the judgment being passed on the family. Her father grew grimmer and quieter, his earlier defiance worn down by the weight of community disapproval. Only Sarah remained steadfast, despite pressure from her own husband to distance herself. "Harold says I'm making things worse by continuing to associate with you," Sarah admitted one afternoon as they sat in Evelyn's small bedroom, the only place they could talk without being overheard. "He says the town council is considering asking your family to leave Redwood Hollow entirely." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "They can't do that, can they?" "They can make life unpleasant enough that you'll want to leave," Sarah said grimly. "That's how it works. They freeze you out, damage your father's business, make it clear you're not welcome until you have no choice but to go." "All because I organized some books," Evelyn said bitterly. "All because you dared to reach above your station," Sarah corrected. "Because you made them question the natural order they've built their world on. If a shopkeeper's daughter can capture the attention of the wealthiest man in the territory through her intelligence and character, what does that say about all the pretty pedigreed girls who've been taught that their only value is in their appearance and social connections?" It was uncomfortably perceptive. Evelyn had always known the town's cruelty came from somewhere deeper than simple gossip, but she'd never quite articulated it this clearly. "So what do I do?" she asked helplessly. "You have 3 choices," Sarah said, ticking them off on her fingers. 1, you can leave town and start over somewhere else. 2, you can publicly repent, admit you were wrong to pursue Lucas, and beg the town's forgiveness. Or 3, she paused, meeting Evelyn's eyes. "You can marry him." "He asked," Evelyn admitted quietly. "I said no." Sarah's eyes widened. "You said no? To Lucas Harrington? Evelyn, why?" "Because he doesn't love me." The words hurt to say out loud. "He cares about me, yes, but he proposed out of duty, to save my reputation. And I can't, I won't, build a life on that foundation. I'd rather be ruined than married to someone who chose me because he felt obligated." "Even if being ruined means destroying your parents along with yourself?" It was the question Evelyn had been avoiding, and having it spoken aloud made her flinch. Her pride, her principles, her refusal to settle, were they worth the price her family would pay? Before she could answer, they heard raised voices from downstairs. Evelyn and Sarah rushed to the landing to see her mother in the entrance hall, facing down Mrs. Pemberton and 2 other women from the church. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Mrs. Pemberton was saying, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But the Ladies' Aid Society has voted to ask you to step down from your position. Given the circumstances with your daughter, we feel it's best—" "Best for whom?" Thomas Moore demanded, appearing from his study. "Best for the society, or best for your sense of moral superiority?" "Mr. Moore, please," one of the other women said. "We're not trying to be cruel, but surely you can see that having Mrs. Moore in a leadership position when her daughter is embroiled in such scandal, it reflects poorly on all of us." My daughter has done nothing wrong, Thomas said, his voice shaking with suppressed fury. She's worked honestly, conducted herself with propriety, and her only crime is being smarter and braver than the small-minded gossips who are trying to tear her down. That's your opinion, Mrs. Pemberton said stiffly. But the Ladies' Aid Society has standards to maintain. We cannot have our good name associated with— She stopped abruptly as Evelyn descended the stairs, her chin raised and her eyes blazing. Say it, Evelyn demanded. Associated with what? With me? With a woman who dared to have a conversation with a man without apologizing for her intelligence? With a woman who forgot her place, Mrs. Pemberton said coldly, dropping the pretense of sympathy. With someone who used her position to pursue a man so far above her that the very idea of them together is laughable. Then why are you all so threatened by it? Evelyn shot back. If the idea is so laughable, why do you need to band together to destroy me? What are you so afraid of? The question hung in the air, and Evelyn saw the answer flicker across their faces. They were afraid that she might actually succeed, afraid that the rules they'd built their lives around might not be as immutable as they'd believed, afraid that intelligence and character might actually matter more than pretty faces and proper bloodlines. We're not afraid of anything, Mrs. Pemberton said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. We're simply protecting the moral fabric of our community. By ostracizing a woman who's committed no actual sin? Evelyn's mother said quietly, surprising everyone. Margaret Moore rarely contradicted anyone, least of all the formidable women of the Ladies' Aid Society. But now she stepped forward, placing herself between the visitors and her daughter. By destroying a family's reputation based on gossip and innuendo. Is that really what Christian charity looks like? Mrs. Moore, no, Margaret said firmly. I've listened to your judgment for weeks now. I've watched you tear apart my daughter for the crime of being educated and employable. I've heard the whispers about how I failed to raise her properly, how I should have taught her to be more biddable, more willing to diminish herself. And I'm done. If maintaining your standards means sacrificing my daughter's dignity, then I want no part of your society. The three women stared at her in shock. Thomas Moore crossed to his wife's side, taking her hand. I believe you ladies should leave now, he said quietly. They left in a flurry of offended dignity, but Evelyn barely noticed. She was staring at her mother, this woman she'd always thought of as weak and overly concerned with appearances, and seeing someone entirely new. Mother, she whispered. Margaret turned to her, and there were tears in her eyes, but also something else. A fierce, protective love that Evelyn had always known was there, but had never seen expressed so boldly. I'm sorry, her mother said. I'm sorry I ever made you feel like you needed to be less than you are. I was afraid for you, afraid that being too smart, too outspoken would bring you pain. And I was right, it has brought pain. But I was wrong to think the solution was to make yourself smaller. The problem isn't you, darling, it's them. Evelyn crossed to her mother and wrapped her in a fierce hug, feeling something tight and painful in her chest finally begin to loosen. When she returned to the ranch on Monday, Evelyn half expected to find the delegation had returned, or that Lucas would have changed his mind about continuing her employment. Instead, she found him waiting with a grim determination that matched her own. I've made a decision, he said without preamble. About Marianne and her lies. Lucas, I'm going to confront her publicly, tomorrow at the town meeting. I'm going to lay out exactly what happened, that she invited herself to the ranch, that she made assumptions about our relationship that had no basis in reality, that she's been spreading falsehoods because I refused to marry her. That will make things worse, Evelyn protested. It can't get much worse, Lucas said flatly. Your mother has been forced out of the Ladies' Aid Society. Your father's business is suffering. The church council is pressuring your family to leave town. Meanwhile, Marianne is being treated like a tragic heroine, and you're being painted as a scheming villain. Someone needs to tell the truth, and that someone is going to be me. Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways this could backfire. But she was so tired of being passive, of accepting judgment without defending herself. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe the only way forward was through confrontation. Then I'm coming with you, she said. If you're going to defend me publicly, I should be there. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw respect and fear and something deeper warring in his expression. "This is going to get ugly," he warned. "It's already ugly," Evelyn replied. "At least this way, we control the narrative." But neither of them could have predicted just how ugly it would truly become, or what Marianne's final, desperate gambit would reveal about the secrets Lucas had been keeping, secrets that would force Evelyn to question everything she thought she knew about the man she'd come to love. The town meeting was held in the church hall on Tuesday evening, and by 6 o'clock every seat was filled. Word had spread that Lucas Harrington would be making a statement about recent events, and the entire population of Redwood Hollow had turned out to witness what promised to be the most dramatic confrontation the town had seen in years. Evelyn sat in the back row between her parents, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She dressed with deliberate care in her most modest dress, her hair pulled back severely, every inch of her appearance calculated to project respectability and dignity. Sarah sat directly behind her, a silent show of support that meant more than words could express. Marianne Whitlock occupied a place of honor in the third row, surrounded by sympathetic women who patted her hands and shot venomous looks toward Evelyn. She looked perfect, as always, her expression a masterful blend of wounded dignity and brave composure. When she caught Evelyn's eye, her smile was sharp and triumphant. Mayor Blackwood called the meeting to order with his usual pomposity, droning through mundane town business while the crowd shifted restlessly, waiting for the real show to begin. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, he cleared his throat importantly. "We have one final item on tonight's agenda," he announced. "Mr. Lucas Harrington has requested the floor to address certain rumors that have been circulating regarding his household and his association with Miss Evelyn Moore. Mr. Harrington?" Lucas rose from his seat near the front, and even from the back of the hall, Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders. He'd worn his finest suit, and the lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, making him look every inch the wealthy rancher whose word should carry weight. "Thank you, Mayor Blackwood," Lucas said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "I'll be brief. Over the past weeks, I've become aware that malicious falsehoods have been spread about Miss Evelyn Moore and the nature of her employment at my ranch. These lies have damaged her reputation, caused her family considerable distress, and created an atmosphere of suspicion where none is warranted." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marianne's expression remained carefully neutral, but Evelyn saw her hands tighten on her handkerchief. "The facts are simple," Lucas continued. "In November, I hired Miss Moore to organize my personal library, a task for which she is exceptionally qualified. She has worked 3 days per week, always in the presence of my housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, and her friend, Miss Sarah Chen, as chaperone. No impropriety has occurred. No scandal exists beyond what has been manufactured by gossip and deliberate misrepresentation." "Then why did Mrs. Whitlock leave your ranch so suddenly?" someone called from the crowd. "She was your guest, and then she was gone. What happened?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Whitlock arrived uninvited and made certain assumptions about our relationship that were unfounded. When I made it clear that those assumptions were incorrect, she became upset and chose to leave. That's all there is to it." "That's not how she tells it," Reverend Thomas said, standing. "Mrs. Whitlock has testified that she witnessed inappropriate behavior between you and Miss Moore, that she tried to counsel you as a friend but was rebuffed. Are you calling her a liar?" "I'm saying she's mistaken," Lucas said carefully. "Or perhaps she saw what she expected to see rather than what actually occurred." "How convenient," the Reverend replied coldly. "You claim propriety while dismissing the testimony of a woman who's known you since childhood, a woman whose character is beyond reproach." "Is it, though?" Lucas asked quietly, and the question landed like a stone in still water. "Is her character truly beyond reproach? Or have we all simply accepted her version of events because she's beautiful and well-connected and tells us what we want to hear?" Marianne stood abruptly, her face pale. "How dare you? After everything we've been through together, after I stood by you through Catherine's death." "You left," Lucas interrupted, his voice hard. 3 weeks after Catherine's funeral, you left for Europe. You weren't here during the worst of my grief, Marianne. You were touring the continent and sending me letters about how I needed to move forward as if grief operated on a schedule." I gave you space to heal, Marianne protested, her voice breaking convincingly. I hoped that when I returned, enough time would have passed that you could see what we could be to each other, what we were always meant to be. We were never meant to be anything, Lucas said flatly. You decided that yourself, based on some childhood fantasy. I never encouraged you. I never promised you anything. You didn't have to promise, Marianne said, tears now streaming down her face. Real tears, Evelyn noted with grudging admiration. The woman was an exceptional actress. Everyone knew. Our families understood. Even Catherine knew that if anything ever happened to her, you and I would— Don't, Lucas said sharply. Don't you dare speak for Catherine. She never said anything of the kind. Because she didn't want to upset you, Marianne insisted. But she told me. In those last weeks before she died, she made me promise to look after you, to help you find happiness again. She wanted us together, Lucas. She gave us her blessing. The hall erupted in whispers. If Catherine herself had approved of Lucas and Marianne's union, then surely his current attachment to Evelyn Moore was not only inappropriate, but a betrayal of his late wife's wishes. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. This was Marianne's masterstroke, invoking the dead wife's blessing, a claim that could never be verified or refuted. It was brilliant and ruthless and utterly devastating. Lucas stood frozen, his face drained of color. Whatever he'd expected from this confrontation, it clearly wasn't this. That's a lie, he finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction. Catherine she wouldn't have— Ask Mrs. Rodriguez if you don't believe me, Marianne said, turning to address the crowd rather than Lucas. She was there during those final days. She heard Catherine talking about the future, about who she wanted to care for Lucas when she was gone. She knows I'm telling the truth. All eyes turned to Mrs. Rodriguez, who stood near the side door looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. The housekeeper's face was troubled, conflicted, and Evelyn felt her heart sink. Mrs. Rodriguez, Mayor Blackwood prompted, can you confirm or deny Mrs. Whitlock's claim? The older woman looked at Lucas, then at Marianne, then finally at Evelyn. Something passed across her face, regret, maybe, or apology. Mrs. Catherine did speak of Mrs. Whitlock in those final days, she said carefully. She was worried about Mr. Lucas being alone. She mentioned that Mrs. Whitlock had always cared for him, that perhaps— She trailed off, clearly unwilling to finish the sentence. There, Marianne said triumphantly. You see? I'm not making this up. Catherine wanted us together, and instead of honoring her wishes, Lucas has become entangled with a woman who's completely unsuitable, who's used her position to seduce him away from what Catherine wanted for him. I didn't seduce anyone, Evelyn said, her voice ringing clear despite her terror. She stood, feeling every eye in the hall turned toward her. I organized books, that's all. Whatever Mr. Harrington feels or doesn't feel is his own business, not dictated by a deathbed conversation that may or may not have happened the way Mrs. Whitlock claims. And who are you to question it? Mrs. Pemberton demanded, standing as well. You, who's been alone with him for weeks despite knowing how it would look? You, who's caused nothing but scandal since you started working at that ranch? I've been properly chaperoned every single moment, Evelyn shot back. And the only scandal has been the one you've all created with your gossip and assumptions. The scandal is that you've forgotten your place, Reverend Thomas said, his voice booming with righteous authority. You're a shopkeeper's daughter, Miss Moore. You have no business associating with a man of Mr. Harrington's standing, no business entertaining notions above your station. Your pride and ambition have brought shame on your family and disruption to this community. My pride? Evelyn felt something snap inside her, all the years of swallowed anger and quiet acceptance burning away in a sudden white-hot fury. You want to talk about pride? What about your pride in keeping women ignorant so you can feel superior? What about the pride that says a person's worth is determined by their birth rather than their character? What about the pride that would rather destroy someone than admit your petty social hierarchies might be wrong? That's enough, the mayor said sharply. Miss Moore, you will sit down and show proper respect. Respect has to be earned, Evelyn interrupted. And you've earned nothing but my contempt. All of you who've spent weeks tearing me apart for daring to have a mind of my own, who've punished my family for my refusal to be diminished, who've accepted every lie Mrs. Whitlock has told because it confirms what you already wanted to believe. These are not lies, Marianne said, her voice shaking with what might have been genuine emotion. I loved Catherine like a sister. I love Lucas like... She stopped, pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. I'm trying to protect him from making a terrible mistake, from betraying Catherine's memory by marrying someone so beneath him that their union would be a mockery of everything their marriage represented. Catherine never cared about social standing, Lucas said suddenly, his voice cutting through the noise. She married me despite her family's objections, despite everyone saying a rancher's son wasn't good enough for a Boston debutante. She valued character over breeding, intelligence over pedigree. So if you're going to invoke her memory, Marianne, at least be honest about who she actually was rather than reshaping her into someone who would support your own prejudices. I knew her better than you think, Marianne said coldly, dropping some of her wounded act. I knew she regretted marrying you, that she found life on a Montana ranch stifling and provincial, that she died still dreaming of the sophisticated life she'd left behind. Now that is a lie, Mrs. Rodriguez said sharply, stepping forward. Mrs. Catherine loved this land, loved her life here. She told me 100 times that marrying Mr. Lucas was the best decision she ever made. Then why did she tell me something different? Marianne demanded. Why did she spend her last months writing to me about how lonely she was, how isolated, how much she missed civilization? Because she was dying, Lucas said, his voice breaking. Because she was terrified and in pain and looking for comfort wherever she could find it. Yes, she missed Boston sometimes. Yes, she found the winters hard and the isolation difficult. But she never regretted our marriage, never wished she'd chosen differently. He turned to face the crowd fully, and Evelyn could see tears on his face now, 5 years of grief finally spilling over. You want to know the truth? He said. The truth is that Catherine was complicated. She was brilliant and difficult, and sometimes unhappy, and always, always worth loving. She wasn't a saint to be venerated or a symbol to be used in other people's arguments. She was a woman, flawed and real and mine. And the idea that I would dishonor her memory by choosing someone like Evelyn Moore is absurd because Evelyn is exactly the kind of woman Catherine would have admired. Strong-minded, educated, unwilling to compromise herself for anyone's comfort. That's who my wife was, and that's who I'm choosing now. The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn felt her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. You're choosing her? Mayor Blackwood said slowly. You're saying you intend to marry Miss Moore. Lucas looked at Evelyn, and in his eyes she saw fear and hope and a question he was asking without words. This was it. The moment she'd refused before, offered now in the worst possible circumstances. Not in the privacy of his library, but in front of the entire town, with her reputation in tatters, and his judgment being questioned by everyone he'd known his whole life. If she said yes now, it would look like validation of every accusation Marianne had made. It would confirm that she'd been scheming to trap him all along. Her father's business would be destroyed. Her family would be driven from town. She would be forever known as the woman who used seduction and manipulation to rise above her station. But if she said no, if she rejected him publicly after he'd just defended her so completely, she would humiliate him, confirm the town's belief that she was exactly as unworthy as they'd always said, and lose forever the chance at the life she'd only just begun to imagine. Lucas, she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying through the silent hall. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything, he replied. I know the timing is terrible. I know this isn't the romantic proposal you deserve, but I meant what I said. You're exactly who I choose, if you'll have me. Evelyn looked at her parents. Her mother was crying, but she nodded. Her father's face was grim but resigned, and in his eyes she saw a pride that had nothing to do with social standing. She looked at Sarah, who mouthed, "Do it," with such fierce certainty that Evelyn almost laughed. She looked at Marianne, whose perfect face had crumbled into an expression of disbelieving fury. And finally she looked back at Lucas, this man who'd valued her mind before her face, who'd defended her against his oldest friend and the entire town, who'd exposed his own grief and vulnerability to tell the truth about who she was. Yes, Evelyn said, I'll marry you. The hall erupted. Some people stood to applaud, Though whether in genuine support or simple appreciation for the drama, Evelyn couldn't tell. Others shouted objections, demanded the mayor intervene, called for the reverend to refuse to perform such an inappropriate union. Marianne stood frozen for a long moment, then turned and swept from the hall with her supporters hurrying after her. Through the chaos, Lucas crossed to Evelyn and took her hand, right there in front of everyone. His fingers were shaking. "I should have asked you properly," he said, "with a ring and flowers and—" "This was perfect," Evelyn interrupted, squeezing his hand. "Terrifying and public and completely inappropriate, just like us." He laughed, the sound slightly hysterical, and pulled her close. Someone gasped at the impropriety of the embrace. But Evelyn didn't care. Let them gasp. Let them gossip. She'd given them plenty to talk about already. "I need to tell you something," Lucas said quietly, his mouth near her ear. "Something I should have told you before. About Catherine and what Marianne said." Before he could continue, Reverend Thomas's voice boomed over the crowd. "This engagement cannot stand," he announced. "It's based on impropriety and scandal. I will not perform a marriage ceremony for two people who've conducted themselves with such blatant disregard for moral standards." "Then we'll find someone who will," Lucas said, not loosening his hold on Evelyn. "There are other ministers in Montana Territory. And I'll make sure every one of them knows the truth about this situation," the Reverend threatened. "About how this woman seduced you, how she's betrayed the memory of your late wife, how this entire engagement is a farce designed to legitimize an inappropriate relationship." "You do that," Lucas said evenly. "Spread whatever lies you want. It won't change the fact that I'm marrying her." "If you go through with this," Mayor Blackwood said, trying to sound reasonable, "there will be consequences. Social consequences. Business consequences. The other ranchers may refuse to work with you. The town may decline to do business with your ranch. You could find yourself as much an outcast as Miss Moore." "Then I'll be an outcast," Lucas replied. "I've spent 5 years caring what this town thinks of me, letting other people dictate how I should grieve and when I should move on and who I should become. I'm done with that. If the price of marrying the woman I choose is your approval, then your approval was never worth having." Evelyn looked up at him, seeing the man she'd first met in the general store transformed. The grief was still there. It would probably always be there. But it no longer defined him. He looked alive again, present, willing to fight for something that mattered. "We should go," she said quietly, "before this gets any uglier." They made their way toward the exit, Evelyn's parents and Sarah forming a protective cordon around them. But before they could reach the door, Marianne's voice rang out one final time. "Ask him about the letters," she called. "Ask him what Catherine really said about you, Lucas. Ask him why he's kept them hidden all these years." Lucas froze mid-step. Evelyn felt his hand tighten on hers almost painfully. "What letters?" she asked. "It doesn't matter," Lucas said, but his voice had gone hollow. "It's just more of Marianne's manipulation. Catherine wrote to me every week during her illness," Marianne continued, addressing the crowd rather than Lucas. "Letters about her fears, her regrets, her wishes for the future. I have them all. And in those letters, she begged me to make sure Lucas didn't make the mistake of marrying someone inappropriate after she was gone. Someone who would drag down the Harrington name and ruin everything she'd worked to build." "Stop," Lucas said, his voice rough. "Just stop." "She was specific," Marianne pressed on, clearly sensing victory. "She said he should marry someone from their own circle, someone educated in the right schools, raised with the right values, someone who understood what it meant to maintain a certain standard. She was terrified he'd settle for less in his grief." "And you're claiming Evelyn is that less?" Sarah demanded angrily. "I'm not claiming anything," Marianne said with false sweetness. "I'm simply repeating what Catherine wrote, what she wanted. If Mr. Harrington won't honor his wife's dying wishes, that's his choice. But he should at least be honest with Miss Moore about what Catherine really thought of women like her." Evelyn turned to Lucas, searching his face. "Is it true? Did Catherine write those things?" "I don't know," Lucas said miserably. "I never read them. Marianne offered to show me the letters after Catherine died, but I couldn't. I didn't want to know her fears and pain. I wanted to remember her healthy and happy." "How convenient," Marianne said. "You won't read the letters, so you can pretend they don't say what they say." You can rewrite Catherine into someone who would approve of this match when the truth is she'd be horrified. Show us the letters then, Evelyn said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. If they say what you claim, prove it. Marianne's smile was triumphant. I'd be happy to. They're at my hotel. We can go right now if you'd like. Let everyone see exactly what Catherine Harrington thought of social climbers and inappropriate attachments. Evelyn, you don't have to do this, Lucas said quietly. Whatever those letters say, it doesn't change how I feel about you. But it might change how I feel about myself, Evelyn replied. If Catherine really did think women like me were beneath her husband, I need to know that. I need to understand what I'd be stepping into. They made a strange procession through the dark streets of Redwood Hollow. Lucas and Evelyn, her parents and Sarah, Marianne and her supporters, Mayor Blackwood and Reverend Thomas, and a substantial portion of the crowd who'd attended the meeting, all eager to see how this drama would resolve. The hotel lobby was too small to accommodate everyone, so they moved to the dining room where the proprietor hastily cleared tables to make space. Marianne swept upstairs to her room and returned with a wooden box tied with ribbon, placing it on the table with ceremonial precision. These are Catherine's letters, she announced, written over the 18 months of her illness. I've kept them safe, treasured them as the last words of my dearest friend. I never wanted to share them publicly, but since Miss Moore insists, just show us, Evelyn interrupted. No more speeches. If these letters condemn me, let them do it quickly. Marianne untied the ribbon and pulled out a stack of letters, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant and educated. She selected one from near the top of the pile and held it up. This is from 3 months before Catherine died, she said, then began to read aloud. My dear Marianne, I fear for Lucas after I'm gone. He has such a tender heart despite his rough exterior, and I worry he'll be vulnerable to the wrong kind of woman. Someone who sees his wealth and position rather than his character. Someone who might take advantage of his grief. Promise me you'll help him find someone appropriate, someone worthy of the Harrington name. Someone like you, perhaps. You've always understood our world in a way few others do. A murmur ran through the crowd. Evelyn felt sick, but she kept her face carefully neutral. Another one, Marianne continued, selecting a second letter. From 6 weeks before the end. The isolation here weighs on me more each day. I miss intelligent conversation, cultural refinement, the company of educated people. Lucas does his best, but he's a rancher at heart, content with simple pleasures. I fear that after I'm gone, he'll settle for even less, marry some local girl who can't tell Wordsworth from Whitman, who'll turn the house into something provincial and crude. Please, Marianne, don't let that happen. Help him maintain the standards we built together. Lucas made a sound like he'd been struck. Evelyn looked at him and saw that his face had gone white, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She didn't mean it, he said hoarsely. She was in pain, she was frightened. She meant every word, Marianne said, but there was something strange in her voice now, something that didn't quite ring true. I have dozens more just like these, all expressing the same fears, the same wishes for your future. Let me see them, Mrs. Rodriguez said suddenly, stepping forward. Let me see the letters. Why? Marianne asked, her hand tightening protectively on the box. Because I was with Mrs. Catherine every day of her illness, the housekeeper said flatly. I heard everything she said, read every letter she wrote, and something about these doesn't sound right. Are you calling me a liar? Marianne demanded. I'm asking to see the letters, Mrs. Rodriguez repeated. All of them, not just the ones you've selected. For a long moment, Marianne hesitated. Then, with a show of injured dignity, she handed over the box. Mrs. Rodriguez took it to a nearby table and began carefully examining each letter, reading quickly, her expression growing darker with each page. Finally, she looked up at Marianne with something close to contempt in her eyes. These are real, she said. The handwriting is Mrs. Catherine's, the paper is hers, even some of the sentiments are genuine, but they've been altered. That's absurd, Marianne protested. Words have been added, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, holding up one of the letters to the lamplight. See here? The ink is slightly different shade, and here, where the paper has been scraped thin, someone erased the original words and wrote new ones. Mrs. Catherine did write about worrying for Mr. Lucas's future. She did express fears about him being lonely, but she never said these specific things about avoiding local girls or maintaining social standards. Those words aren't hers. The room erupted in shocked voices. Marianne's face had gone from pale to bright red. "You're lying," she said desperately. "You're making this up to protect them." "I don't need to lie," Mrs. Rodriguez said coldly. "The truth is written right here in the different ink colors and the scraped paper. You took real letters and changed them to say what you wanted them to say. You've been using a dead woman's words to manipulate the living." "That's a serious accusation," Mayor Blackwood said heavily. "Mrs. Whitlock, if these letters have been tampered with—" "I changed nothing," Marianne insisted, but her voice had lost its conviction. "Catherine wrote those words. I merely clarified certain passages that were unclear, made explicit what she implied. She would have wanted Lucas to understand her true feelings." "So you admit you altered them," Evelyn said quietly. Marianne whirled on her, all pretense of wounded dignity gone. "You don't understand. You couldn't possibly understand. Catherine and I grew up together. We were like sisters. When Lucas married her, I lost my best friend to this godforsaken wilderness. I spent years watching her waste away in letters, growing more isolated, more unhappy. And when she finally died, I honestly thought, that Lucas would see sense, that he'd come back to civilization, to our world, to me. But I didn't want that," Lucas said, his voice heavy with dawning understanding. "You've spent 5 years waiting for me to become someone I never was, someone Catherine never wanted me to be." "She did want it," Marianne insisted, tears streaming down her face now. Real tears, Evelyn thought, but not of grief, of fury and thwarted ambition. "She told me so herself. Maybe not in those exact words, maybe not written down, but I knew. I knew she regretted leaving Boston, regretted choosing a ranch over a real life. She chose me," Lucas interrupted. "She chose this life. And yes, it was hard sometimes. Yes, she missed her old world, but she never regretted the choice, never wished she'd married someone else. Someone like you." The words hung in the air, brutal in their honesty. Marianne stood frozen, her perfect composure shattered, and for the first time Evelyn almost felt sorry for her. This was a woman who'd built her entire life around a fantasy, who'd waited 5 years for a man who'd never wanted her, who'd twisted a dead friend's words to justify her own obsession. "I think," Mayor Blackwood said carefully, "that Mrs. Whitlock should probably leave Redwood Hollow. Tonight, if possible." "I've done nothing wrong," Marianne protested weakly. "You've forged documents and used them to slander an innocent woman," the mayor replied. "You've manipulated a grieving widower and dishonored the memory of the dead. Those aren't criminal offenses, perhaps, but they're certainly enough to make you unwelcome here." Marianne looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only cold stares and turned backs. Even her supporters had abandoned her in the face of this revealed duplicity. "Fine," she said, gathering the remnants of her dignity. "I'll leave your pathetic little town, but mark my words, this won't last. Lucas, when you wake up one morning next to that shopkeeper's daughter and realize what you've given up, what you've settled for, don't come crying to me. I won't be waiting anymore." She swept from the room, and this time no one followed. In the silence that followed, Evelyn became aware that her legs were shaking. The entire evening had been a nightmare of public exposure and private pain, and she desperately needed to sit down before she fell down. Lucas must have noticed because he immediately guided her to a chair, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. For Marianne, for the letters, for making you endure this public spectacle. Stop apologizing," Evelyn said firmly. "None of this was your fault." "The Reverend was right about one thing, though," Reverend Thomas himself said, surprising everyone. He'd been quiet throughout Marianne's exposure, watching with troubled eyes. Now he stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "This engagement does need to be handled properly, but not because it's inappropriate, because it deserves better than to be overshadowed by scandal and manipulation." He turned to address the remaining crowd. "I owe Miss Moore an apology. I let gossip and prejudice cloud my judgment. I assumed the worst because it fit my preconceptions about proper social order. But watching her conduct herself with such dignity tonight, Watching her demand the truth, even when it might hurt her, that's real character. That's the kind of strength a partnership should be built on. Are you saying you'll perform the ceremony? Lucas asked, hardly daring to hope. I'm saying I'll need to pray on it, the Reverend replied. But yes, I believe I will, if Miss Moore's family agrees and if we can do this properly. With a proper engagement period, proper planning, no rushing into marriage to escape scandal. How long? Evelyn asked. 3 months, the Reverend said firmly. Time enough for the town to accept this, for the gossip to die down, for you both to be certain this is what you want without the pressure of public scrutiny. 3 months. It felt like an eternity and no time at all. Evelyn looked at Lucas, saw the question in his eyes, and smiled despite her exhaustion. 3 months, she agreed. We can wait 3 months. The crowd began to disperse, some people offering congratulations that ranged from genuine to grudging, others still muttering disapproval but no longer quite so certain of their ground. Evelyn's parents embraced her, her mother crying again, but this time with something that might actually be joy. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Sarah pulled Evelyn aside. You did it, she said, her eyes bright. You stood in front of the whole town and demanded to be valued for who you are. Do you know how brave that was? I didn't feel brave, Evelyn admitted. I felt terrified. Bravery isn't the absence of fear, Sarah said. It's doing the right thing despite the fear. And you were magnificent. Outside, the December night was clear and cold, stars brilliant against the black sky. Lucas took Evelyn's hand as they walked back toward her family's house, and for a few precious moments they had something approaching privacy. What Catherine actually wrote in those letters, Evelyn said quietly. Do you want to know? Mrs. Rodriguez said she'd tell me when I was ready, Lucas replied. The real words, not Marianne's inventions, but not tonight. Tonight, I just want to walk with you and pretend none of this happened. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. In 3 months, Lucas said eventually, you're going to be Evelyn Harrington. I might keep Moore, Evelyn said thoughtfully. Evelyn Moore Harrington. I rather like the sound of that. Lucas smiled. Evelyn Moore Harrington, the woman who organized my library and my entire life. The woman who was everyone's last choice until she became my first choice. I was never the last choice, Evelyn corrected gently. I was just waiting for someone who could see what I was worth. Turns out, I was worth waiting for. Yes, Lucas agreed, stopping to face her fully, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. You were definitely worth waiting for. When he kissed her, right there on the public street where anyone could see, Evelyn didn't care about propriety or appearance or what the Reverend might think. She kissed him back with all the passion and promise of their impossible, improbable future, and felt something that had been locked tight inside her for her entire life finally break free. She'd been the woman no one chose. But now she was choosing herself. And Lucas was choosing her, and together they were choosing a life built on respect and partnership and the revolutionary idea that love might matter more than social standing. 3 months from now, she'd walk down an aisle and marry the wealthiest man in Montana Territory. But tonight, she was already wealthy beyond measure in the ways that actually mattered. The morning after the town meeting, Evelyn woke to find Redwood Hollow transformed. Not physically. The same wooden buildings still lined the muddy streets. The same mountains rose in the distance. The same winter sky pressed down gray and heavy. But something fundamental had shifted in the town's collective consciousness, like a fever finally breaking after days of delirium. By the time she opened the general store at 8 o'clock, 3 customers were already waiting, women who'd crossed the street to avoid her just yesterday. They came in sheepishly, buying small items they clearly didn't need, offering awkward congratulations on her engagement while carefully not mentioning the spectacle that had preceded it. Evelyn accepted their olive branches with grace, even as she noted which women still stayed away, which families had decided their dignity required maintaining the grudge. Sarah arrived mid-morning with fresh bread from her kitchen and news from around town. Marianne left on this first stage out this morning, she reported, settling onto the stool behind the counter. Didn't even wait for breakfast. The hotel clerk said she looked like she hadn't slept at all. I almost feel sorry for her, Evelyn said, and was surprised to find she meant it. 5 years of waiting for something that was never going to happen. That's a special kind of heartbreak. She brought it on herself, Sarah replied without sympathy. Forging letters, manipulating everyone, trying to destroy you out of spite. That's not heartbreak. That's obsession. Maybe it started as love and turned into obsession when it wasn't returned, Evelyn suggested. The line between them is probably thinner than we'd like to think. Sarah gave her a sharp look. You're very philosophical for someone who was nearly ruined by that woman's scheming. I suppose facing down the entire town gives you perspective, Evelyn said wryly. When you've already endured the worst they can throw at you, it's easier to be generous. But generosity didn't mean forgetting. Over the next days, as the scandal's immediate heat faded into the general background noise of town gossip, Evelyn discovered that the battle for her reputation wasn't over. It had simply entered a new phase. The question now wasn't whether she and Lucas had behaved improperly, but whether their engagement was appropriate at all. Whether a shopkeeper's daughter could really become the wife of Montana Territory's wealthiest rancher without disrupting the entire social order. Mrs. Pemberton and her circle might have been forced to accept the engagement's existence, but they made their disapproval clear through 1,000 small cuts. They discussed wedding plans in Evelyn's hearing, mentioning details she couldn't possibly afford. Imported lace, champagne from France, guest lists that included territorial governors and railroad magnates. They wondered aloud whether Evelyn knew which fork to use at formal dinners, whether she'd be able to manage a household staff, whether she understood the social obligations that came with being Mrs. Lucas Harrington. The implication was always the same. She might have captured Lucas's attention, but she'd never truly belonged to his world. Evelyn tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the concrete reality of her upcoming marriage rather than the social anxiety it provoked. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed, she sometimes wondered if they were right. Not about her worth, she'd fought too hard to claim her value to doubt it now, but about the practicalities of crossing such a vast social divide. Lucas seemed to sense her uncertainty. When she arrived at the ranch the following Monday to resume her library work, now with her mother as chaperone instead of Sarah, a change that felt both more respectable and somehow more significant, he suggested they take a break from cataloging to discuss wedding plans. I know the Reverend said 3 months, he said, as they sat in the library with Margaret Moore positioned tactfully at the far end of the room, pretending deep interest in a botanical text. But we haven't actually talked about what kind of wedding you want. What would make you happy? Evelyn set down the book she'd been cataloging. Honestly, something small, just family and close friends. I don't need a spectacle. You deserve one, though, Lucas said firmly. You deserve a beautiful dress and flowers and a celebration worthy of the occasion. Don't let the town's judgment make you think you should settle for less. I'm not settling, Evelyn protested. I just don't want to give people more ammunition. If we have a lavish wedding, they'll say I'm putting on airs, that I'm trying to buy my way into respectability. If we have a simple one, they'll say I couldn't manage anything better. Either way, I lose. Lucas reached across the table to take her hand, then glanced at Margaret and withdrew it, settling for an intense look instead. So we stopped playing their game entirely. We have the wedding we want, regardless of what anyone thinks. If that's small and simple, wonderful. If it's grand and elaborate, equally wonderful. But we make the choice based on what would make us happy, not on what will generate the least gossip. What would make you happy? Evelyn asked. Lucas was quiet for a moment, considering. I want you in a beautiful dress, he said finally. I want to see you walking toward me and know that you're choosing this freely, that it's not obligation or social pressure or trying to escape scandal. I want our families there. Your parents, Mrs. Rodriguez, the ranch hands who've become like family to me. Beyond that, I don't care. 20 people or 200, church or courthouse, spring flowers or winter evergreens, none of it matters as long as you're there at the end of it. The simplicity of it made Evelyn's throat tight. Then let's do something in between. Not a spectacle, but not hiding either. A real wedding with the people who matter. In the church because I like the way the light comes through the windows in the afternoon, with a dress that's beautiful but not ostentatious. And a reception where we can actually talk to our guests instead of performing for them. That sounds perfect, Lucas said, and his smile was so warm that Evelyn momentarily forgot her mother was watching. They spent the rest of the afternoon in pleasant planning, discussing flowers and music, and whether March would be too cold or if they should wait until April. Margaret occasionally offered suggestions, her input growing more confident as she realized Lucas genuinely valued her opinions. It felt normal in a way Evelyn hadn't quite expected. Not like planning a society wedding to cement an alliance, but like building the foundation for an actual partnership. But normalcy, Evelyn was learning, was a fragile thing in Redwood Hollow. The second blow came a week later, when her father arrived home from the bank with an expression Evelyn had never seen on his usually mild face, a mixture of fury and fear that made her stomach drop. "They've called my loan," he said without preamble, sinking into his chair at the kitchen table. "The bank is demanding full payment within 30 days or they'll foreclose on the store." Margaret gasped. "But Thomas, you've never missed a payment. You've been with that bank for 15 years. "I know," he said tiredly, "but apparently my recent association with scandal makes me a poor credit risk." Those were the bank manager's exact words. He was very apologetic about it, very sympathetic, but the board had made their decision and there was nothing he could do. Evelyn felt cold fury wash through her. "This is because of my engagement." "This is because some small-minded men can't bear the thought of social boundaries being crossed," her father corrected. "They're making an example of us, showing what happens to families who let their daughters reach above their station." "How much do you owe?" Evelyn asked, her mind already racing through possibilities. "More than we have," Thomas admitted. "I could sell the inventory, maybe raise half, but not enough to satisfy the loan. We'd lose the store either way. The store that had been in their family for 20 years. The store that Evelyn had transformed into a thriving business. The store that represented her father's life's work and her own future before Lucas had offered her a different path. "I'll ask Lucas," Evelyn said immediately. "He'll lend us the money." "Absolutely not," her father said sharply. "I won't have people saying you married him to save your family's business. That's exactly the kind of talk we've been trying to avoid." "But if we lose the store, then we lose it," Thomas said firmly. "We'll find another way. Maybe move to Billings, start fresh where the gossip hasn't followed us. Your mother and I will manage. We always have." Evelyn looked at her mother, who was crying silently, and felt something break inside her. Her parents were being punished for her choices, for her refusal to stay small and quiet and appropriately humble, for daring to imagine she could be more than the town had decided she deserved to be. She left the house without a word, ignoring her mother's protests, and walked through the darkening streets to the edge of town where the road to the Harrington Ranch began. It was too far to walk in the fading light, but she needed to move, needed to burn off the rage and helplessness churning in her chest. She'd made it perhaps a mile when she heard hoofbeats behind her and turned to see Lucas riding toward her on his black mare, his face creased with concern. "Mrs. Rodriguez saw you walking this direction from the kitchen window," he said, dismounting. "What's wrong?" Evelyn told him everything, the called loan, the impossible deadline, her father's refusal to accept help. Lucas's expression darkened with each word. "This is Henderson's doing," he said when she finished, naming the bank's primary shareholder. "He's on the church board. He's been vocal about his disapproval of our engagement. This is his way of forcing your family to leave town. Can he do that? Is it even legal?" "It's legal enough," Lucas said grimly. "The loan terms probably give the bank the right to call it due for any reason. They're just using that clause to punish your father for your supposed sins." "Then we have to fight back," Evelyn said. "There must be something." "There is," Lucas interrupted. "I'll buy the loan from the bank, pay it off directly. Then your father owes me instead of Henderson, and I won't call it due." "He'll never accept that," Evelyn said, even as hope flickered in her chest. "He doesn't want people thinking I married you for money." "Then we make it a business transaction," Lucas replied, already working through the problem. "I'll buy the store outright, pay fair market value, maybe a bit above. Your father stays on as manager, keeps running things exactly as he has been. We draw up a contract that gives him the option to buy it back over time at the same price I paid. That way it's not charity, it's a business deal between partners." "Lucas, that's incredibly generous." "It's incredibly selfish," he corrected, "because I'm not willing to let you choose between marrying me and saving your family. I won't have you spending the rest of our lives wondering if you made the right choice, if you should have sacrificed your happiness for theirs. This way, Nobody has to sacrifice anything. Evelyn looked at him in the fading light, this man who kept finding ways to value her without demanding she diminish herself, and felt the last of her doubts crumble. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could think better of them. "I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe when you first asked me about the lending library. Maybe when you defended me against Marianne. Maybe just now when you offered to solve a problem you didn't create. But I love you." Lucas went very still. "You told me no when I proposed because you didn't think I loved you yet," he said carefully. "You said to ask again when I was ready. But Evelyn, I think I've been ready for weeks now. I just didn't realize it because it felt so different from what I had with Catherine." "Different how?" "Catherine and I fell in love young," he said slowly, working through the thoughts as he spoke them. "It was passionate and romantic and built on the kind of certainty you only have when you're 22 and think you know everything. What I feel for you is quieter, but somehow deeper. It's built on actually knowing you, your mind, your strength, your refusal to be anything less than yourself. It's choosing you every day, consciously, because spending time with you makes me want to be better than I am." He took both her hands in his, there on the darkening road with no witnesses but the mountains and the emerging stars. "I love you, Evelyn Moore, not because you saved me from loneliness or organized my library or stood up to the whole town. I love you because you're brilliant and brave, and you make me laugh, and you challenge every lazy assumption I've ever had about what matters in life. And I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you, if you'll let me." Evelyn kissed him, right there in the open, where anyone passing by could see. And this time when she said yes, it wasn't to a proposal made in desperation or public pressure. It was a promise freely given to a man who'd proven he would value her always, in all the ways that mattered. When they finally pulled apart, Lucas was smiling in a way she'd never seen before. Unguarded and almost boyish, the last shadows of grief finally lifting. "I should probably talk to your father," he said, "about the store and about marrying his daughter, properly this time." "He'll say yes to both," Evelyn predicted. "He's stubborn about charity, but he's also practical, and he already likes you." They rode back to town together, Evelyn seated behind Lucas on the mare, her arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek pressed against his back. She felt the solid reality of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and allowed herself to believe that this was real. That happiness was something she was actually allowed to have. Thomas More proved easier to convince than Evelyn had feared. He bristled initially at the idea of Lucas buying the store, but when Lucas presented it as a genuine business opportunity, expanding his ranch's supply chain, establishing a presence in town, diversifying his investments, her father's resistance crumbled. They spent an hour hammering out details while Evelyn and her mother waited in the kitchen, listening to the low rumble of male voices discussing terms and timelines and contractual obligations. When they finally emerged, both men looked satisfied, if slightly exhausted. "It's settled," Thomas announced. "Lucas will purchase the store and the inventory at a fair price. I'll continue as manager at a salary we've agreed on, with the option to buy it back over 10 years if we choose. The transition will happen immediately, so the bank loan can be paid off before the deadline. And," Lucas added, "I've asked your father's permission to marry you. He's given his blessing, conditional on you actually wanting to go through with it." "I believe I've made my feelings clear on that subject," Evelyn said, unable to suppress her smile. Margaret burst into tears, happy ones this time, and pulled Evelyn into a fierce embrace. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I ever made you think you should be smaller, quieter, less than you are. I was so afraid the world would hurt you for being yourself, and instead it was my fear that nearly broke you." "You were trying to protect me," Evelyn said, her own eyes stinging. "I understand that now. But, Mother, I need you to understand that I'd rather be hurt for being myself than safely miserable pretending to be someone else." "I do understand," Margaret said, pulling back to look at her daughter properly. "And I'm so proud of you. So proud of the woman you've become, despite everyone telling you to be less." The news of Lucas's purchase spread through Redwood Hollow with predictable speed, and the reactions were mixed. Some saw it as proof that Evelyn had indeed been scheming all along, that she'd seduced Lucas specifically to access his wealth and save her family's failing business. Others, a growing number, though still a minority, saw it as a generous gesture from a man who understood that supporting his future wife meant supporting her family as well. Henderson and his allies on the church board were furious, their plan to drive the Moores from town thwarted by Lucas's intervention. They made their displeasure known through pointed sermons about the proper use of wealth and the dangers of allowing sentiment to override sound business judgment. But their power was limited now that their main weapon had been neutralized. The engagement period that followed was unlike anything Evelyn had imagined. She'd expected 3 months of anxiety and social navigation, of trying to prove herself worthy of Lucas while fending off the town's continued judgment. Instead, she found herself wrapped in a kind of protective bubble created by Lucas's absolute refusal to care what anyone thought. He took her to dinner at the hotel dining room, the two of them sitting at the best table while the other patrons whispered and stared. He brought her to ranch association meetings and introduced her as his fiancée, making it clear that anyone who wanted to do business with him would need to accept her as well. He commissioned a portrait of them together, a scandalous breach of propriety, before the wedding, and hung it in the ranch house entrance hall where every visitor would see it. Most importantly, he continued to treat her exactly as he had before, as an intellectual equal, a trusted partner, someone whose opinions mattered as much as his own. They finished cataloging the library together, then started new projects. Evelyn suggested improvements to the ranch's bookkeeping system. Lucas asked her to review contracts before he signed them. They debated territorial politics and agricultural innovation and whether the new railroad spur would help or harm local businesses. It was everything Evelyn had ever wanted without knowing to want it, a partnership of minds as much as hearts, a marriage being built on respect and shared purpose, rather than just romantic feeling. Not that there wasn't romantic feeling. Lucas courted her properly during those 3 months, with flowers and poetry and long rides through the winter landscape that gradually softened into early spring. He kissed her in the library when Mrs. Rodriguez's back was turned, stole moments of privacy in the ranch house parlor, held her hand during their chaperoned evening walks through town. And Evelyn, who'd spent 26 years believing no one would ever want her this way, discovered what it felt like to be cherished. The wedding took place on a brilliant April afternoon, when the last snow had finally melted and the prairie was starting to show its first hints of green. True to their plan, it was neither extravagantly large nor embarrassingly small, perhaps 60 guests, mostly family and genuine friends, with a handful of territorial officials included for political necessity. Evelyn wore a dress her mother had made, cream-colored silk with delicate embroidery at the cuffs and collar. It wasn't as elaborate as what a society bride might have worn, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, and when Lucas saw her walking down the aisle on her father's arm, the expression on his face made Evelyn feel like the most magnificent woman who'd ever lived. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with surprising warmth, having evolved over the past months from grudging acceptance to something approaching genuine approval. His sermon was about the courage required to build something new, to step outside comfortable boundaries, and trust that love could bridge any divide. When Lucas slipped the ring onto Evelyn's finger, a simple gold band set with a single sapphire the color of Montana sky, his hands were shaking. "I promise to value your mind as much as your heart," he said, departing from the traditional vows. "To never ask you to be less than you are. To build a life with you where both of us can be fully ourselves. I promise to challenge you when you're wrong and support you when you're right," Evelyn replied, her own voice unsteady. "To be your partner in all things, not your subordinate. To love you enough to tell you the truth, even when it's difficult." They were unconventional vows for an unconventional union, and Evelyn heard gasps from some of the older guests. But when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Lucas kissed her with such fierce joy that her feet actually left the ground, the church erupted in genuine applause. The reception was held at the ranch house, with tables set up in the grand parlor and spilling out onto the porches. Mrs. Rodriguez had outdone herself with the food, and someone had brought a fiddle. And as the afternoon faded into evening, the party took on the relaxed warmth of people who were genuinely happy rather than just performing happiness. Sarah cornered Evelyn near sunset, when Lucas had been pulled away by a group of ranchers discussing cattle prices. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Being Mrs. Harrington?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "Terrifying," she admitted. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me there's been a mistake, that I'm not really allowed to have this, but also right somehow. Like I've finally stepped into a life that actually fits. You've changed this town, Sarah said quietly. You know that, right? Every girl growing up in Redwood Hollow now knows that she doesn't have to settle for less than she deserves, that intelligence and strength matter as much as beauty and breeding. You've made space for all of us to be bigger. I just refuse to be small, Evelyn said. I don't think that makes me a revolutionary. That's exactly what makes you one, Sarah replied. The most radical act is simply being yourself and refusing to apologize for it. As the party continued around them, Evelyn watched Lucas across the room, deep in conversation with her father about expansion plans for the store. He caught her eye and smiled, that transformative smile that still made her heart stutter, and she felt the full weight of what they'd built together, not just a marriage, but a genuine partnership between equals. Later that night, after the last guests had departed and they'd retreated to the privacy of Lucas's bedroom, now their bedroom, Evelyn stood at the window looking out at the dark prairie stretching endless beneath the stars. "What are you thinking?" Lucas asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "That I was wrong," Evelyn said softly. "All those years I thought I was the woman no one chose. But the truth is, I was the woman who wouldn't let herself be chosen by anyone who didn't value all of me. I was waiting for someone who could see past the surface to what actually mattered." "And did you find him?" Lucas asked, his breath warm against her neck. "I found someone even better," Evelyn replied, turning in his arms to face him. "I found someone who helps me see my own worth, who makes me braver and stronger just by believing I already am." Lucas kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her mouth, and in that kiss Evelyn felt all the promise of their future. The arguments they'd have and resolve, the children they might raise to value character over pedigree, the library they'd continue to build together, the life they'd create on their own terms. She'd been the last choice for marriage in Redwood Hollow, the woman everyone pitied and no one wanted. But Lucas Harrington, the wealthiest man in the territory, had chosen her above all others, not despite her sharp mind and sharper tongue, but because of them. Not to save her, or fix her, or manage her, but to partner with her in building something neither could create alone. And in choosing her, he'd given her the greatest gift of all, permission to fully, finally, unapologetically choose herself. The next morning, Evelyn woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the sound of Lucas moving quietly around the room, trying not to disturb her. She watched him through half-closed eyes, this man who was now her husband, and felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. "I know you're awake," Lucas said without turning around. "You're breathing differently." Evelyn smiled. "How long have you been up?" "An hour or so. I couldn't sleep, too happy." He turned to face her, fully dressed for the day. "Mrs. Rodriguez is making breakfast. Your parents are coming over later to discuss the store's quarterly inventory, and I thought maybe this afternoon we could start planning that addition to the library you mentioned, the reading room with the big windows." "That sounds perfect," Evelyn said, sitting up. "But Lucas, don't you have ranch work, actual business to attend to?" "I have a foreman who handles the daily operations," Lucas replied, "and a wife who's shown me that there are more important things than cattle prices and fence repairs. I'm learning to delegate." "You're learning to be happy," Evelyn corrected gently. "Same thing," Lucas said, coming to sit on the edge of the bed. "Turns out happiness requires actually being present in your life instead of hiding from it." They went downstairs to find Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared a feast: eggs and bacon, fresh bread, jam made from last summer's berries. The housekeeper beamed at them both, clearly delighted to have life and love back in the house she'd maintained through 5 years of grief. Over breakfast, they made plans: the store expansion, the library addition, a trip to Billings to meet with suppliers, possibilities for starting a real lending library in town, open to everyone, not just those who could afford to buy books. "That will ruffle some feathers," Lucas warned. "Free access to books for everyone? The church board will say you're promoting dangerous ideas." "Good," Evelyn said firmly. "Dangerous ideas are exactly what this town needs, starting with the revolutionary notion that knowledge shouldn't be restricted to those born into the right families." Lucas laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "There's my firebrand wife. I was worried marriage might make you cautious." "Marriage to the right person makes me braver," Evelyn replied, because now I have someone who'll stand beside me when I challenge the status quo. Always, Lucas promised. In the weeks that followed, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Evelyn moved her belongings to the ranch house, transforming one of the spare bedrooms into a study where she could work on the store's accounts and her library projects. She hired 2 young women from town to help with the cataloging system she was implementing, giving them employment and education simultaneously. The town's attitude continued to shift, slowly but perceptibly. Some families remained stubbornly opposed to the marriage, refusing to acknowledge Evelyn's new status. But others, particularly the younger generation, began to see her as proof that the old social boundaries were more permeable than they'd been taught. Girls who'd been told to hide their intelligence started speaking up in school. Women who'd accepted their limited roles started questioning whether those limits were truly necessary. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. The slow awakening of a community to the possibility that worth might be measured by something other than birth and breeding. Evelyn's parents thrived under the new arrangement. Her father managed the store with renewed energy, implementing improvements Evelyn suggested and seeing the business grow steadily. Her mother, freed from the anxiety of potential ruin, rediscovered her own long-buried interests. She'd been quite the artist as a girl, it turned out, and now she set up an easel in their kitchen and painted the Montana landscape she'd been too busy to properly see for 20 years. 6 months after the wedding, on a golden October afternoon, Evelyn stood in the newly completed library addition, a beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the prairie, and officially opened the Harrington Public Library to the town. 15 people attended the ribbon cutting, including several who'd been her harshest critics. "This is a place for everyone," Evelyn announced, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Rich or poor, educated or just learning, young or old. The only requirement is curiosity and respect for the books. Knowledge belongs to all of us, not just the privileged few." Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been dragged to the event by her daughter, sniffed audibly. But even she couldn't deny the beauty of what Evelyn had created. A warm, welcoming space filled with books on every subject, organized with meticulous care, open to anyone who wanted to learn. That evening, as Evelyn and Lucas walked through the empty library, admiring the way the setting sun painted the walls gold, Lucas pulled her close. "Your father told me something interesting today," he said. "The store has had its best quarter ever. Profits are up nearly 40% from this time last year." "That's wonderful," Evelyn said, pleased but not surprised. She'd known her suggestions would help. "He wants to buy it back," Lucas continued. "Not immediately. He knows the contract gives him 10 years. But he's started saving already. He says another 2 or 3 years and he'll have enough." "How do you feel about that?" Evelyn asked carefully. "Proud," Lucas said simply. "Proud that we helped him get back on his feet. Proud that you saw the solution when I couldn't. Proud that we're building something here that's bigger than just our own happiness." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I love you, Evelyn Harrington. I love who you are and who you help me be. I love that you're never satisfied with the status quo, that you keep pushing for better even when it would be easier to accept good enough. I love that you chose me, freely, knowing exactly what you were getting into." "I love you too," Evelyn said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Even though you're stubborn and occasionally infuriatingly certain you're right, even though you still wear your wedding ring from Catherine on a chain around your neck and probably always will." Lucas touched the chain beneath his shirt, looking surprised that she'd noticed. "Does that bother you?" "No," Evelyn said honestly. "She was part of your life, part of who you became. I wouldn't want you to forget her any more than I'd want you to forget any other important experience that shaped you. I'm not competing with her memory. I'm building something new with you, something that honors your past while creating our future." "How did I get so lucky?" Lucas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You chose someone who wouldn't let you settle for less than you deserved," Evelyn replied. "And I did the same. We both chose bravely, and now we get to live bravely together." They stood in the Golden Library as darkness fell outside, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something revolutionary from their refusal to accept the limitations others had tried to impose. The woman no one had wanted, and the man everyone had tried to claim, choosing each other freely and changing their world in the process. In the years that followed, their story would become legend in Redwood Hollow. The scandalous courtship, the dramatic confrontation, the marriage that bridged seemingly unbridgeable divides. Children would grow up hearing about the shopkeeper's daughter who married the richest man in the territory, and the lesson they'd take from it would depend on who told the story. Some would say it was about luck, being in the right place at the right time, catching the eye of someone wealthy enough to overlook social boundaries. Others would say it was about scheming, about a clever woman who used her position to seduce her way into a better life. But those who knew Evelyn and Lucas, who saw them working side by side in the library or the store, who watched them challenge each other and support each other and build a partnership based on mutual respect rather than social convention, they would know the real truth. It was a story about courage, about refusing to accept the limitations others placed on you, about choosing authenticity over acceptance, partnership over possession, love over social approval, about two people who'd been shaped by loss and judgment, finding healing in each other's honest company. Evelyn Moore had been the last choice for marriage in Redwood Hollow. But when Lucas Harrington chose her above all others, he wasn't choosing the woman no one else wanted. He was choosing the woman who'd had the strength to wait for someone who would value all of her, mind, heart, and stubborn, uncompromising soul. And in that choice, they'd both found freedom. As winter closed in again and the first snow began to fall on the Montana prairie, Evelyn stood at the ranch house window watching the white world transform outside. Behind her, she heard Lucas moving through the rooms of their home, heard Mrs. Rodriguez singing in the kitchen, heard the crackle of fire in the hearth and the whisper of wind against the windows. She thought of the girl she'd been a year ago, bitter and resigned, certain she'd spend her life alone, accepting that no one would ever value her sharp mind and sharper tongue. She thought of all the years spent making herself smaller, quieter, more palatable to people who would never truly see her anyway. And then she thought of who she'd become, a woman who'd stood before her entire community and demanded to be valued for exactly who she was. A wife and partner to a man who cherished her intelligence as much as her heart. A pioneer of sorts, showing other women that there were paths beyond the ones society had laid out for them. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still people in Redwood Hollow who looked at her with disapproval, still whispers about inappropriate ambition and disrupted social order. But increasingly, there were also young women who looked at her with hope, who saw in her story proof that they didn't have to choose between being themselves and being loved. That was worth all the judgment, all the scandal, all the difficult days when she'd wondered if fighting for herself was worth the cost. Because she hadn't just saved herself, she'd opened a door for others to follow. Lucas came to stand beside her at the window, slipping his arm around her waist in the easy intimacy of people who knew they belonged together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come," Evelyn said softly. "About how I used to think I was the woman no one chose, when really I was just waiting for the one person who would choose me for the right reasons." "Best decision I ever made," Lucas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Choosing you." "Best decision we both made," Evelyn corrected. "I chose you right back, remember? That's what makes this work. It's not about one person selecting the other like livestock at market. It's about two people choosing each other freely and continuously, every single day." Outside, the snow fell faster, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, the fire burned warm and bright, lighting a home that had been dark for too long. And in that moment, wrapped in Lucas's arms while the Montana winter raged beyond their windows, Evelyn Moore Harrington was exactly where she belonged. She'd been the last choice for marriage in town, but she'd become the first choice for herself, and in doing so, she'd found everything she'd never known she was allowed to want: love, respect, partnership, and the revolutionary freedom to be exactly who she was without apology. The woman no one chose had chosen herself, and in that choice, she'd found her happily ever after.